Should I be frightened of my house, or can I just be over it? My family and I, my dad, my sister, and my mom, moved into this house when I was 6. When we first moved, I hated it here. I was constantly scared and seeing shadows and hearing weird stuff. And once I even jumped out of the shower with shampoo all over my head and ran downstairs crying to my mom because I felt someone breathe next to my ear. I would have friends over, and when we were alone in the house, we would hear things and be scared. Almost the whole home is wood flooring, and we'd hear creaking like someone was walking around. Throughout this time in our new home, I found out later that my parents were hearing music coming from the attic while they were in bed. Piano music, sometimes radio music. My father is someone who takes no shit, and I've never seen him be scared of anything. So we'd walk right up and pull down the stairs to the attic and check it out. As soon as he got to the top, the music would stop. He checked the whole attic, and there was nothing that could produce music. My mother told me this years later, as she knew I was already too afraid. So in my high school years, I would go to bed and lock my door at night. But my dad wasn't one to knock, and I was often doing things I shouldn't be doing in there. And one night I woke up in the middle of the night, and mind you, I'm a person that you have to shake to wake, and to my doorknob being violently shaken in its locked state. Seeing the hour, I jumped out of bed and opened the door immediately, assuming it was my dad or something was wrong. No one was there. I go back to sleep thinking I must be dreaming or crazy or something. This happened a total of 2 or 3 times over a fairly large span of years. I've also had knocks on my door in the middle of the night and early morning. My response is usually, yeah? Nobody enters. I open the door, nobody there. The last isolated incident I can remember was in 2016. I was working at a salon, and the owner's daughter, who I became quite close to, died of an overdose. Our birthdays were 3 days apart, and we'd always celebrate together at the salon. She had just passed in January, and it was her birthday night. It was late, 1 or 2 a.m. I was on the toilet in my bathroom and happened to be thinking about her. I said out loud, "Happy birthday, Bonnie." And boom, start hearing wild piano music above me in the attic. I freaked out and ran downstairs, woke up my mom, who was sleeping on the couch because my parents no longer slept in the same bed. And this is when she told me about the music when I was a kid. So 2 weekends ago, there was nothing good on TV on Sunday, surprise, surprise. So I put on Unexplained. For those of you who don't know, it's a ghost hunting show with qualified people doing the hunting, paranormal investigators and mediums. I kind of like the thrill of being scared watching stuff, but I don't like being scared in my own home. My mom and I watched for a few hours until I went to pick up food. I took her car because it was easier. There was this water bottle on her back seat swishing around and making noise in the car. I had been in her car the day before running hours worth of errands and didn't notice this at all. I felt a weird presence and scaredness while I drove. I told myself I'm just creeping myself out because of the show. That night, I go to bed, all good, not thinking about anything scary. At 9 a.m., I wake up to 4 soft knocks on my bedroom door. I assume it's Mom, and I say, "Yeah?" Nothing. I go back to sleep for an hour or 2. Wake up later and ask her if she knocked on my door this morning. Answer is no. So the very next night, I go to sleep. I have this old Harman Kardon speaker and bass in my bedroom. It's 4 a.m. and the thing is humming, like loud and creepy. Hum, hum, hum. Each one of the tones sounds like it's more echoey and closer. I quickly turn on the phone's flashlight. It stops immediately. I've grown older in this house, and for a very long time I stopped feeling scared. I was watching that show and having odd things come back to light, and the spirit's own way of telling me they're still here. I don't know. Rant over. Shapeshifting spirit outside my home? Yesterday, a strange encounter left me feeling bewildered and unsure of what to do next. As I stepped outside my home, I came face to face with a spirit whose appearance was constantly shifting, as if they were undergoing a never-ending process of digital art editing. Their features were never static, changing every few seconds, and it was hard to keep up with the rapid pace of transformation. To make matters more perplexing, the spirit commented on my distracted state of mind, which was due to my attempt of astral planning being disrupted by my fiance's loud snoring. Despite the strange circumstances, I didn't feel any overtly negative energy emanating from the spirit, but rather a sense of deep desperation and longing that left me feeling quite moved. The spirit then asked if it could come inside my home, to which I promptly declined, quickly returning to my body and reinforcing the house's protective barriers. However, despite my immediate reaction, I couldn't shake the sense that this spirit had been wandering aimlessly for a long time, searching for something that they couldn't seem to find. As I am situated close to a school, I also received a strong intuition that the spirit spends a lot of time around children, which only added to my growing concern. Feeling a strong desire to help this lost soul, I'm now seeking any insight or guidance that can help me in my efforts to release them from their current predicament. There's a ghost in my laundry room. One day, as I was going to go do laundry, I went to close the laundry door, but to my surprise, I couldn't. It was as though something or someone was holding the door back. As I walked into the room, I felt an icy cold breeze that was uncharacteristic of the usually hot and stuffy laundry room, and in that moment I realized that a ghost was present in my laundry room. At first, the thought of calling a priest or paranormal investigator crossed my mind. However, upon further reflection, I realized that this ghost was harmless and only wanted to play around. Although it could be unsettling to hear the laundry room door slowly open by itself, or feel its presence, it never caused me any harm. Initially, the ghost used to hold the door back frequently and prevent me from closing it. However, after a while, it seemed to grow bored of this activity and stop doing it. It still lingers in the laundry room, not really doing anything, but I know it's there. Overall, despite the spooky nature of the situation, it's become part of my everyday life, and I've grown accustomed to the presence of this friendly ghost. There was a banging on my closed bedroom door, and no one was there. I'm visiting my sister and sleeping in their only spare bedroom, because her 2 kids have the other rooms. These bedrooms are upstairs. My sister and her husband sleep in the only bedroom on the first floor. There's a sliding window in my bedroom, and it was closed during what happened to me. It was around 7 p.m. when the 3 and 2-year-old nephews were playing those push toys on the downstairs hardwood floor. I was upstairs in my bedroom playing my Nintendo Switch at the foot of the bed that's near the door to the upstairs hallway. Because of the kids' noise, I shut my door to limit it. Maybe 10 to 15 minutes later, I heard my 2 9-year-old make a yelp, which made me realize my sister's putting him to bed. He's still at the age where he sleeps in a crib, and my sister shuts her kids' door when they go to bed. The lights in the bedroom, hallway, 3-year-old nephew's bedroom, and my bedroom had their lights on. This is what happened. As I said before, I was playing my Switch, and then there was this constant banging on the door. I immediately thought that she was mad that the TV volume was too loud or something's wrong. I jumped from the bed and opened the door. No one was there. In a split second, I started panicking and ran for the stairs. The stairs are halfway across the living room downstairs, where I saw my sister and her friends hanging around the 3-year-old nephew as they watched a kids show. I asked her, "Were you knocking on my door?" And she replied with some worried look on her face and said, "No, I didn't." What do I make out of all this? I can't think of an explanation for what happened. I never suspected my 2-year-old nephew, stuck in his crib, escaping, opening the door and knocking and rushing back inside. The amount of time it took me to open the door was a few seconds, and I would have caught him rushing back to his room. There's no history of any terrible events happening at my sister's house. No one died there. There were no murders there. I know because my sister's house is the house I grew up in, and it was a new construction home. I'm baffled by what happened, but weirdly I got a thrill out of it. Did I witness a spirit leave the place they died? When I was a mere 11 years old, my father and I made a life-changing decision to relocate from Spain to Germany. We settled into an apartment that had previously been occupied by an old man who, according to the hearsay, passed away peacefully in his sleep. At the time, I was unaware of this, but I would soon come to realize the gravity of the situation. As I lay in bed at night, there loomed a massive pitch-black shadow that seemed to emanate from the corner of my room. It cast an eerie pall over the surroundings, and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that came with it. At first, I assumed it was just my overactive imagination, perhaps fueled by the depression I was experiencing due to my recent move and other personal issues. But as the months and years wore on, I began to question the shadow's origins. Nothing in my room could have possibly cast such a deep, inky blackness into just one corner. I was stumped, and it nagged me like a persistent itch. Then one fateful day I stepped out of the shower and into my room, only to be greeted by a sudden blinding flash of light that emanated from the very corner where the shadow had taken up residence. The brightness was so intense it startled me to my core, and I fled to the living room couch to seek refuge from the night. When I returned to my bedroom, the shadow was nowhere to be found. It was as if the light had dispelled it once and for all. From that moment on, the room no longer felt creepy or unsettling. I never saw the shadow again, and as the years passed, I found myself wondering if the old man had once lived there had somehow remained unable to depart until that fateful night. Now I'm almost 16 years later. I still reside in the same apartment, but my father, who had been my companion on this particular journey, has passed since. The memory of that shadow in the light particularly that banished it, lingers with me, and I can't help but wonder if it was a manifestation of something supernatural or simply a figment of my imagination. Nonetheless, it remains a mysterious and indelible part of my personal history. What do I do with this doll? My dog thinks it's haunted. I have a doll that I bought at an antique shop, and I'm not sure what to do with it. I'm not a doll person, but I saw this Japanese, doll set up high in the corner shelf, priced at $1, and I bought it along with a 3-piece vanity mirror. I don't know exactly why I got the doll, but I felt sorry for her or something. Her hair was poorly glued on and only halfway attached. She was covered in dust. She had maybe a happier, kind-looking face. I felt bad that she was priced so low. I brought her home and cleaned her up a bit and put her on the shelf of our bedroom with a couple of Japanese carvings from my grandpa. My mom was born in Tokyo and spent most of her childhood there, although we're born PNW white people. The same weekend I got the doll, I brought her home, and my one dog Bonnie starts freaking out. She's my favorite of our 3, and probably the best dog I've ever had. She's a little 11-year-old chocolate lab, and has always been easy, simple, happy, and she's never had a care in the world, and that changed. Although I didn't connect the two situations at first. Bonnie's always been the easiest dog in the world, but she became clingy, extremely anxious and destructive. She didn't want to come into my room to sleep anymore, and would pant, whine, and try to leave if I called her in. One day I left and came right back because I forgot something, and I heard her barking, like her life depended on it, and it turned out she was standing and barking at my closed bedroom door. I also started having some worsening problems. I've had issues with insomnia, and I'm pretty well versed on it, but it became far worse than I ever thought possible. I started having night terrors, and one in particular is what brought me here. I had the doll on my shelf for about a week, and was questioning whether I wanted to keep her, or also whether I wanted the antique mirror that I bought at the same time and put on the dresser, kept in my room. The same night, I dreamt I couldn't move and there was a presence that wasn't letting me speak or move. Well, during this nightmare, the freaking mirror shattered and woke me up. It was the middle of the night and made an enormous mess, but at least I woke up. I moved a bunch of the stuff, including the doll, to a storage closet. But we're always under some kind of home renovation, so there's no doors, just a curtain. Bonnie didn't waste much time. She tried to dig her way into the closet, which is where I stashed the doll. She had never in her life done anything like this. Bonnie has become easily stressed and doesn't want to be without us in the house. I tried putting her in a crate that she used to like as a youngster, but she stopped needing it and we needed the space. She cracked a tooth trying to escape. We began taking her everywhere with us, in our car, and even though it's pretty cold out, she prefers to come with us rather than be at home without us. The weird thing to me is that the other dogs don't care about the doll at all. I want to get rid of the doll, but I just don't think throwing her away is the right approach. Maybe some kind of burial. I just don't want to make things worse, but I'm not sure what to do next. I could give the doll away, but what if it's really haunted or something? I don't want anyone else to be negatively affected. I was thinking of going back to the store and leaving her where I got her, but is that a good idea? This is all new to me apart from watching the occasional scary movie. Mostly, to be honest, I really want my dog to get better. My parents took her for a few days and all she's done there is sleep like crazy. I don't think she was sleeping at all at home. I just want her back and her sweet happy self. I saw my friend after he died. When I was 12, I had a friend. His name was Jay. He was 14. He was my cousin's good friend. I was just starting to become good friends when this started. He was an eccentric person. He was very into medieval times and would talk like them too. Because of that, he didn't have many friends. I didn't mind. I found him funny. He was also huge into botany. He would often go into the woods to study plants, finding edible ones and non-edible ones. I went with him a few times, and every single time he would have his dog. It was a Jack Russell Terrier. He also always wore a specific orange hoodie with his last name on it. Just a bit of info on him. I remember the night before, I could have sworn I heard ambulances rushing nearby. The day of, I was supposed to go to my cousin's house. I was about a 25-minute walk or 10-minute bike ride. There is a clearing with a very small entry to the woods Jay liked using as a way to enter. When I'm about 50 yards away, I see him in his orange sweater and his dog walking to the entry. I yelled his name, but he never looked up. I eventually got to the opening and saw him and yelled his name again. He never turned and kept walking. Not even his dog, and that dog loved me. I was going to follow him, but felt lazy, so I just went straight to my cousin's house. When I got there, he wasn't home, and his stepdad opens the door. He tells my cousin he isn't home, and breaks the news that Jay was in an accident. Apparently, he was coming back home from being in the woods, later than usual, and was hit by a drunk driver on his way home. He didn't die immediately, but died a few hours later from his injuries. His dog died immediately. I called my cousin, and he confirmed it. I was shocked and never told anyone what I saw. I always kept that doubt with me. He lived with his grandmother, and I'll never forget her at the funeral. I miss that kid. He never bothered anyone, and everyone left him alone when he did his botany stuff. I saw someone in the reflection of my laptop. As a private banker, I found myself enjoying my job and the sense of fulfillment that comes with helping clients navigate their financial lives. Typically, my workday ends promptly at 5 p.m., giving me ample time to unwind and enjoy the rest of my day. However, on this particular day, I found myself falling behind on some important tasks due to my recent vacation and made the decision to stay late and catch up on my work. As I sat at my desk surrounded by 3 computers that make up my workspace, I focused intently on the task at hand, determined to finish before the night was through. It was at this point that things took a strange turn. While attempting to send an email to my boss to let him know that I'd be working late, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Assuming it was one of my coworkers coming to check on me, I politely asked them to wait a moment as I finished typing my message. However, what happened next left me feeling completely unnerved. As I looked up, the reflection of my laptop screen, I saw a figure walk past that was so tall and dark it was almost impossible to believe. Standing at an imposing 7 feet tall, this mysterious figure was like nothing I'd ever seen. Without thinking, I spun around in my chair, expecting to see a colleague or some other explanation for the strange occurrence. But to my surprise, there was no one there. I quickly scanned the area, peering out of my office in both directions, but saw no sign of the figure that had just walked past me. Despite my best efforts to ignore the eerie experience and focus on my work, I found myself unable to shake the feeling of unease that settled over me. Fueled by a growing sense of dread, I worked as quickly as I could to finish my tasks, eager to get out of the office and away from whatever strange presence had made itself known. In the end, I managed to complete my work and make my way home without further incident. However, the memory of that ominous figure remains with me, and I know that I'll never be able to be comfortable working late in the office ever again. Did she send me a message? 14th of March is a difficult date for me. It's the day we lost my cousin. She was my best friend, my twin soul, and after 13 years of losing her, the pain's still fresh. She was killed when her drunk roommate crashed her motorbike with my cousin riding the pillion. My cousin never wanted to go out that night. Her roommate dragged her out, and my cousin paid the ultimate price. I often wondered if she'd moved on, or if she's not around us anymore. Because initially, after she died, I could feel her presence around me. I saw her in my dreams, smelled her perfume, and even heard her. 2 months after she died, I went to her home for the first time and I couldn't sleep at night. We always slept together, talking and singing late until night. I broke down and asked her for a sign, and then I heard her voice. It sounded like it came from the radio, but it was her. I always felt her presence, and for some reason, I felt like she was trying to comfort me, but I was freaking out, so she's maybe keeping her distance. It was heavy-handed, and we are Hindus, so we have many rituals involved in helping a departed soul cross over. After her rituals were done, I could no longer feel her. So I thought she was gone, but something happened today. After nearly 13 years, that has me questioning things. As always, her death anniversary sucks for me. I was getting ready to go to work, and I was trying to get outfits. I couldn't find a decent shirt. I was already mopey and suddenly thought, give me a sign she's still around. And suddenly I found an old blouse of hers that I still have. This blouse had been missing for over a year. I thought my mom had thrown it away. But finding it out of nowhere was weird, considering that my mom had rearranged my wardrobe, and it was under a few clothes that I wasn't sure were there before. I started crying when I found it, and it was such a soothing feeling. My question is, did she really respond, or was it simply coincidence? Weird flash of light. To provide some context, I'm currently house-sitting for a close friend. It was approximately an hour ago at around 10:30 p.m. when I had an unnerving experience. As I was sitting in the living room, I saw a bright flash of light, akin to that of a camera flash. Given that all the blinds in the room were closed, I was almost certain that it couldn't be someone outside taking a picture of me. Additionally, I was able to confirm that there were no footprints in the snow outside, which ruled out any physical presence outside the house. To assuage my fears, I checked the light bulbs and made sure none of them were burnt out. Furthermore, I thoroughly searched for any hidden cameras or motion light that could have been the source, but I found nothing, and despite my best efforts to rationalize the situation, I was left with no plausible explanation for what I had witnessed. As you can imagine, this experience is quite unsettling, especially since it caught me off guard, and I couldn't easily explain it away. I'm left feeling quite confused and worried about what this could mean. Has anyone had a similar experience? Or could anyone offer any ideas as to what this could be? Perhaps there's something paranormal or supernatural happening in the house that I'm unaware of. It's times like these when I wish I had someone to turn to for answers, as the inexplicable nature of this occurrence has left me feeling both perplexed and uneasy. I encountered the smell and very strange timing. It was a strange and eerie night when I experienced something inexplicable that left me feeling utterly terrified. It was around 4 or 5 a.m., and I had gone to the bathroom. As I was leaving, I heard a loud bang on the door. I immediately opened it, and nobody was there except my trusty dog. At first, I assumed my dog had smacked the door with his tail, but as I stepped out, I was struck by an overpowering aroma that filled the hallway. It was an intense fragrance of flowers or some other sweet-smelling substance like soap. It was as if someone had drenched themselves in soap and stood outside my door. I was bewildered and afraid and asked both my parents if they had used the bathroom during the night, but they both denied it. They also told me that we didn't have any soap with such a strong scent. The feeling of anxiety and fear washed over me like a wave, and I couldn't shake off the sensation that something ominous was happening. The smell was so powerful that I could almost taste it. It lingered in the air, as if someone had just showered and walked out in the hallway without rinsing off the soap. It was then that I mustered the courage to take a step forward, and I walked through the scent. It was so strong that I could almost touch it, but as soon as I took another step into my room, it vanished without a trace. It was the same spot where my fiancé and I had smelled a horrible putrid odor that reminded us of maybe rotten old milk, like a really bad fart. It was a bizarre and unsettling experience that we both forgot until she reminded me of it. I was left wondering if anyone had any idea what could have caused this mysterious phenomenon. Was it a ghost or some other supernatural entity that had made its presence known that particular night? I may never know, but the memory of that strange and inexplicable incident remains etched in my mind. Should I share with my wife? Let me begin by sharing the story of my family in our 70-year-old house, a place that's been our home for the past 8 years. Recently, my wife and I moved into an upstairs bedroom, hoping to make the most of the space and enjoy some much-needed privacy. However, things took a dark and unexpected turn when my wife and son went out for town for a week, leaving me alone in the house. As I slept soundly one night, I was jolted awake by the sound of a whispering voice saying, "Get out." At first, I dismissed it as my imagination running wild, but the experience left me feeling uneasy and unsettled. When my family returned home, I tried to put the incident out of my mind and go about my daily routine as usual. However, that sense of unease only grew stronger as the days went on, culminating in another terrifying experience just last night. Once again, I was sound asleep when I suddenly awoke from the same whisper in my ear, "Get out." This time, there was no mistaking it. The voice was clear and unmistakable, sending shivers down my spine. The more I thought about it, the more I began to wonder if there was something more sinister at play. After all, the previous owner of the house had lived here for their entire life, and they had passed away within these very walls. Her ashes were scattered in the backyard, leaving me to wonder if her spirit was somehow still lingering in the house and trying to communicate with me. Despite my fears, I'm reluctant to share my experiences with my wife, knowing how much it would terrify her. But the more I think about it, the more I realize I just can't keep this to myself forever. Something needs to be done to address this strange and inexplicable thing that keeps happening in our home. As I sit here alone with my thoughts, I can't help but wonder what the future holds for me and my family in this house. Will we be able to coexist peacefully with the ghostly presence that seems to be haunting us? Only time will tell. My childhood home used to be a school, and I'm pretty sure it traumatized me. Now, I don't know a ton about the history of my childhood home, but I know that it was old as hell, one of the creepiest places I've ever lived. It was a 4-story house, fancy, right? With lots of dark spaces and long stairways. Basically, it was really big. There wasn't a moment in that house that I felt like I was truly alone, and there wasn't a hallway that felt truly empty. I was just barely out of toddlerhood when I started to develop severe anxiety. I was afraid to do anything alone. I was always checked behind me, sleeping with my head under the covers, seeing things and hearing things, you name it. I'm almost 100% sure that there was something paranormal making me feel that way. I wasn't the only one seeing and hearing things, though. My older brother shared a room with me, and he always slept on the top bunk. His bed was maybe a foot away from the ceiling, and the attic was right above us. He told me that some nights he'd hear adult footsteps right above his head, just circling the attic. But it gets weirder. He told me that at one point he woke up next to a shadowy figure just lying in the bed with him. He claims the figure had 2 white specks for eyes, and that it wasn't acting malicious, just lying there silently. This might have been some kind of sleep paralysis hallucination, but considering the other events, I wouldn't be surprised if it was some kind of spirit. And now on to the worst one, the playroom. That room was the creepiest fucking thing in the house, and I get shivers just thinking about it. It sat at the end of a long hallway on the top floor, just below the attic. My room was down the hall from it, and it was always pitch black. I remember staying up at night staring at it, just in case something moved. I often couldn't take my eyes away in fear of something appearing if I did. Somehow, every time I looked at that doorway, the door was wide open. And the door wasn't weak either. It worked perfectly fine and wouldn't open unless you turned the knob. I'd ask my dad to close it before I went to bed, and it would just stay closed for a bit, until it slid open again. I'm not a door specialist, but it was just arguably creepy. But wait, there's more. Now that we're older and out of the house, me and my brother found out that we shared a similar terrifying experience. We both saw something incredibly creepy in the same room at the same place. I remember it vaguely. It was a small, neutral, glowing white face in the playroom. It looked a bit like a little kid from my memory. It had no body, just a pure white face in the dark. It was around my height, and its eyes were kind of just not there. I don't remember much, but I remember it was the single most terrifying thing I'd ever been through. I don't know if I hallucinated or what, but I know it felt incredibly real at the time. Maybe it was a dream or something. Because all I remember is seeing that fucking face, getting scared and running back to my bed. I don't think I screamed, but I seriously don't remember. I have a kind of a love-hate relationship thinking about it, because it just makes my hair stand on edge. Thanks to that house, I have now been diagnosed with anxiety. I'm taking medication for it, and I'm alright. But I thought it was worth noting. "666-6666 called me years ago." Let me take you back to when I was 16 years old in high school. I remember vividly that my sister was sitting beside me, and I received a call from a number that had the same area code as mine. This may seem like a coincidence, but for me, it was cause for alarm. You see, I had been experimenting with the Ouija board for several months, and unfortunately, I had encounters with the devil through it. So, when I picked up the call, I was expecting it to be a friend trying to mess with me. However, to my surprise, it was a man who sounded like he was in his 40s or 50s. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to wrap my head around who this could be. I went through a mental Rolodex of people I knew in that age bracket, but no one came to mind. The man asked me where I was, and I responded with a shaky and nervous voice, asking why he wanted to know. That's when things took a dark turn. The man laughed in a way that made my blood run cold. It was an elegant yet sinister laugh. It sounded like it was from the 1950s or 1960s. I can still feel the chills run down my spine as I think about it. It was at that moment that he said, "Don't worry, I'll find you." I was terrified beyond words and hung up the phone immediately. I wanted to prove to my mother what had just happened, so I tried calling the number again, but to my horror, the number didn't exist. This experience left me feeling shaken to my core. I couldn't explain it, and I had no idea who this person could have been or what they wanted from me. It's a memory that stayed with me all these years, and I still shudder when I think about that phone call. Still vividly remembering this 21 years later. When I was a young child of 5 or 6 years old, I had a haunting experience that stayed with me throughout my life. It was a night like any other, or so it seemed, when I woke up in the middle of the night, fully awake and not in a dream. What I saw was something I'll never forget. Right in front of my bed, there was a man standing at the door. He had an Indiana Jones hat, a swirly mustache, red eyes, sharp teeth, and a snake-like tongue. He was watching me and laughing while posing like a hieroglyph. I was petrified with fear and started screaming, but the vision didn't disappear until my father burst into my room. It was a chilling experience, and even now, years later, the image of the man is burned into my brain. Just remembering it brings tears to my eyes. As a child, I'd often see things when waking up in the middle of the night. Some were just fleeting shadows, while others were more vivid and terrifying. But the image of that man has stuck with me like nothing else. My younger brother also had his own night terrors. He would dream of being in our residence parking lot and being chased by something. The thing chasing him would take on different forms, but it would always scream, "Ow, ow, ow, ow," like an owl. These dreams plagued him for a long time until we moved to another apartment. After that, we never had those dreams ever again. It's hard to explain what these experiences were, or why they even happened, but they have left a deep impression on both of us. It makes me wonder if there's something more to this world than what we can see with our own eyes, and if there are these things lurking just beyond our perception that can only be glimpsed in moments of terror and confusion. My second poltergeist encounter. This took place in early 2000s, maybe 2004, in an apartment I lived in with my parents and my brother. Before I tell the story, let me describe what my room looked like. It's relative to the story. My room was pretty basic. Imagine a square, and on the bottom of the square is the entrance to the room, and to the left, on the same wall, is a built-in closet with mirrored doors. On the left wall is a daybed-style bed, looked like a fancy couch. On top of the wall is the window covered with Venetian blinds, and cheap-colored aluminum ones. I always close the blinds when I go to sleep, and they were in the down and closed position, and the room was rather dark, important to note. On the right wall is my computer desk and some shelves. When I would lie in my bed, my head would be towards the windows and my feet towards the closet. I can see the windows from the closet mirror when I look towards my feet. All right, so the story. It was an early Saturday morning back in early 2000. Something and my mom comes into my room and places the cordless phone, remember those, near me on my bed. Why, I hear you ask? It's because the answering machine we have is not good enough for her, so she needs me to answer the phone when she's not home. Makes total sense. My mom places the phone near my head and tells me she's going out with my dad and to answer the phone if it rings. Me, barely conscious of her even talking to me, grunts my assent back to sleep. Around 10 o'clock that morning, my phone rings. It's my friend. Let's call her Jenny. She had a bad habit of calling me every Saturday at 10 a.m. to wake me up because she's bored. No matter how many times I asked her not to call me so early, as if it was my only day off during the week and I'd have to sleep in, she still called every Saturday at 10 a.m. I groggily answered the phone, and this is the short conversation we had. Me. Hello? Jenny, way too cheerful. Hey, how's it going? What are you doing? Do you want to meet up? After a few seconds to realize who I'm talking to. I'm sleeping. Come on, let's meet up. I'm bored. Do you want to come? Do you want me to pick you up? Give me a little bit of time. I'll fully wake up and call you back. Okay, don't take too long. I'm bored. Uh-huh. I hang up, roll over, and fall asleep. For about 5 seconds. And that's when the room floods with light, with the sound of a whoosh. I open my eyes and look down toward the mirror, and at the window and the blinds are now open. You know how Venetian blinds have one string for pulling the blinds up and another stick thing that you twist in order to open it and close the shutters? Well, the shutters were open in the blink of an eye, just whoosh, and they were open. I jumped to a sitting position instantly with my arms over my head, as if being held at gunpoint, blinking the bright daylight suddenly streaming in through the window, screaming in an empty room, Okay, I'm up, goddammit. I picked up the phone and called Jenny, and fully awake now, I said, I'm ready, will you come pick me up now? She said, okay, great, I'll call you when I'm downstairs. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I told her, don't worry about it, I'll be there waiting already. I changed clothes at the speed of light and ran out of my room downstairs and spent the next 15 minutes smoking furiously until Jenny arrived. Later that day when I got back home, I was calmed down enough to see what the fuck happened with the blinds. I mean, if they were open and they fell down, I'd blame gravity or the cheap string that held them together. But they were opened in the blink of an eye. They went up. Against all knows of physics and forces of nature, they went up. I know the blinds were down beforehand because I already woke up twice prior to that happening and the room was rather dark. Usually to open the shutters, you take the stick thing and twist it about 20 times to get them to open fully. I never, and I mean never, was able to open them that fast myself. I even put the stick thing between my palms and tried rubbing them really fast in one direction to get them to open that fast. But nope, didn't work. It only opened a small fraction at a time. That stick thing doesn't open the blinds that easily. It's been around 20 years since that day, and I still can't figure out what the fuck. I guess it was friendly spirit. A spirit who knew I would be asleep for a few hours more and make Jenny just wait and wait. Also, more likely she'd have called me back a few times, and I'd hang up each time with a promise to get up in order to fall asleep again, an accurate description of what would have probably happened. They know me so well. So the spirit decided to save us both the trouble and just wake me the fuck up. Maybe the walls between realities or space-time or whatever was thin that day, or that apartment, and so in one reality I went back to sleep while in the other parallel reality I actually got out of bed and opened the blinds and went on with my day. I don't really know. This is not the only poltergeist activity that's happened in that room. I'll write about that other experience next week, titled My Third Poltergeist. I used to sleep with the nightlight on as I became scared of the dark after a bunch of experiences, and I was in my early 20s. And that day made me realize that ghosts or spirits don't need darkness in order to haunt or interact with you. My grandparents came to say goodbye. When I was growing up, I was very close with my maternal grandparents. I called them Mama and Tata, Mama and Father. That's what I heard my mom call them, and I assumed it was their names when I was about a year old. When speaking of them, I still refer to them this way till today. Tata passed away from a stroke when I was 9 years old, and I never got up to say goodbye. My mom didn't think such a small child should see their grandparent in such a state in the hospital. About 15 years ago, Mama's health was failing. She was in a coma for a couple of weeks. Then she recovered, and there was even talk of sending her home with a nurse. Knowing Mama, since I was very close to her, I knew she would hate that. She was very independent, and she wouldn't like to have someone help her with anything. I felt dread. A few days later, she went back into a coma. The doctor said there was very little chance she would recover. My parents and I were living in a different country from Mama at that time. My mom decided she would go and visit her, and her sister who was taking care of Mama, and asked me if I wanted to go as well. Although I really wanted to go see Mama one last time, I decided not to go for 2 reasons. One reason being I was on summer vacation and I had just gotten a job at a summer camp. Rent needs to be paid. But the main reason being that Mama always told me not to waste my money on traveling for sad occasions, only for happy ones. There was an incident years before, I don't remember what it was, but the lesson stuck with me. So I knew she wouldn't like me to waste so much money on a plane ticket to come and see her as she's dying. About a week goes by, and one night I'm laying in bed trying desperately to fall asleep. It's one of those nights where you keep looking at the clock, repeatedly thinking, if I fall asleep right now, I will have this much time to sleep before I have to go to work. It just wasn't happening, so I gave up. Just laid in my bed, on my back, and stared at the ceiling. I blink. I'm standing on the beach near Mama's house. I can feel the breeze, I can smell and hear the ocean and the seagulls. I can feel the sun on my face. I turn slowly, and about 20 feet in front of me stands Mama, smiling at me. Then she turns around to face away from me, and we both see my grandfather, Tata, standing just behind her. They walk towards each other smiling, they hug and kiss, and they have the most heartfelt reunion I've ever seen. Tata passed away when I was just 9 years old, nearly 20 years prior to that day. I just stared in awe. After what seemed like a few minutes of my grandparents both turn up and look at me. They're holding hands, smiling, tears of joy streaming down their faces. They're just glowing. They wave to me goodbye with their kisses and smiles still on their faces, turn around and start walking away from me and slowly fade. I open my eyes and I'm in my room, lying in my bed, on my back, staring at the ceiling. Tears running down my face. I knew that moment there's two things. 1, Mama passed. 2, I'll not be falling asleep that night. The clock on my phone on the bedside table read 4 a.m. The next few hours were a bit of a blur since I had been inconsolable. I couldn't stop crying. My phone rang at 8 a.m. It was my dad telling me that Mama had passed. I asked him if he knew what time that she had passed. He told me in their country it was 11 a.m. That time difference between our time zones is exactly 7 hours. They're ahead. I must stress that this wasn't a dream. I never actually fell asleep. I didn't feel tired at all that night. Not before and definitely not after that vision. I wasn't even sure which flair to add to this post. Either way, I'm so grateful to Mama and Tata for this wonderful memory, for the love that I felt from them that day. They went out of their way to come see me to say goodbye before moving on. I remember that for as long as I'll live. Possible paranormal activity during a hiking trip. Several years ago, a friend and I went on a multi-day hiking trip during winter. While preparing for the trip, I found a forum dedicated to the trail we'd be hiking, and several threads about it, people going missing on it. Most of the members blamed the hikers themselves, saying they were most likely inexperienced, would-be adventurers who would go off the trail and get lost. There was one old man on the forum who claimed he'd completed the trail once a year for the past 50 or so years, and he believed there was something more sinister behind these disappearances. Naturally, the other members laughed at him. We set off before sunrise to get as many miles in as possible for the day. That entire day, we only met one other person, a friendly middle-aged man who lived somewhat locally. He seemed impressed that we were taking the trail in the winter and even invited us to camp near his property, but we declined and pressed on. That night, we were surprised by some pretty dangerous terrain around the edge of a lake and took the decision to sleep in our bivy sacks under the overhanging rock. Not exactly ideal camping conditions, but given the potential hazards we felt, this was the smartest choice. I don't sleep well at the best of times, and in a bivy sack, and if you've ever been zipped up into one, you'll know how claustrophobic it can feel. The rock hanging over my head didn't help either. A few hours after I did eventually manage to fall asleep, I woke up suddenly to the sound of my friend shouting and swearing at me. I popped my head out of my bivvy and saw that he was still zipped inside his. Had someone gotten off the relatively level ground we would have been sleeping on, was slowly sliding down towards the lake. I quickly got up and dragged him, with great effort, back up to level ground. He was absolutely furious with me, claiming that he had felt something drag him, but soon calmed down and accepted that he'd most likely rolled over him repeatedly in his sleep. We didn't go back to sleep and instead had some coffee and breakfast while waiting for the sun to come up. When we did set off, it started to rain heavily and didn't stop for most of the day. I was almost having some trouble with an old injury with my leg, which slowed us down considerably. The sun seemed to disappear rather suddenly near the top of the deceptively steep hill, so we set up camp, and there and then, this time in the tent. After the rough couple of days we had, we were grateful to be inside of a tent, and the ground underneath us was actually not too bad. We talked and joked about the trip so far, and some of the reason I remember my friend expressing his disappointment that he'd forgotten to pack his iPad, and then we tried to sleep. Soon after I began to hear what sounded like human footsteps. I thought to myself, surely there isn't anyone else here climbing this hill at night. The sound continued, and the more intently I listened, the more I became certain of what I was hearing. I poked my head out of the tent and the sound stopped. I got out to pee and looked around, not a soul in sight. Shortly after getting back into my sleeping bag, the footsteps started again, and this time they started circling our tent. By this time, I was pretty frightened, and I asked my friend, "Are you hearing this?" He responded, "Yes, I fucking am." Knowing that he'd been hearing them the entire time and sounded as freaked out as I did genuinely terrified me. We got out of the tent again and asked if anyone was there, but again, no one was around, and the sound had stopped suddenly. The footsteps around the tent continued for quite some time, and we didn't sleep. As soon as the sun came up, we packed our things, got off the trail, and hiked to the nearest village, got a cab to the nearest town, and made our way home. We've never been able to find a convincing explanation of what could have been causing the sound of the footsteps that night. My friend has since become a full-fledged missing person, paranormal and conspiracy enthusiast. I might be a medium. I don't know what to call this thing I have. This captivating story that took place a few years ago revolves around a young woman and her friend who were hanging out late night and having a conversation. The friend was preparing for surgery the following day, and the narrator was keeping her company to provide her with some much-needed emotional support. As they were chatting about their favorite anime, the narrator suddenly got a strange feeling that they were being watched from inside the friend's house. This unusual feeling was the beginning of an intriguing series of events that would leave the narrator and her friend perplexed. It's worth mentioning that the two had been friends since middle school, but this was the first time that the narrator had met her friend's mom and the other family members. After their anime discussion, they began talking about paranormal topics, which led the narrator to mention that she had experiences with the paranormal since she was a kid. The conversation took an interesting turn when the narrator jokingly offered to read her friend's aura to see if she could pick up on anything. They closed their eyes, and the narrator saw a green and purple color around her friend's outline. She mentioned that she felt like an older woman with curly hair like hers, who liked purple, was over her. The narrator thought that this woman was probably an aunt or grandmother to her friend, and that her passing was something that she had no control over. Following the reading, the friend revealed that the narrator had accurately described her aunt, who had passed away when she was a child. This aunt was one who would take care of her and always told her she was her favorite. The friend's older sister then confirmed that her aunt had died with a brain tumor. The accuracy of the reading left the two women amazed and questioning the reality of supernatural forces that might have played a role in the incident. Since that day, the narrator has more experiences with the paranormal, and she recently had another one just a few weeks ago. Her curiosity has grown, and she would like to understand what people would call this phenomenon. Despite her curiosity, the mystery remains unsolved, and she's left to wonder about the forces that lie beyond our comprehension. In conclusion, this story shows how paranormal experiences can leave people feeling both amazed and perplexed. It's an intriguing account of how our lives are influenced by forces that we cannot explain, leaving us to question the world around us. Running Long Neck Man. As time passed, Jim couldn't shake off the memory of the encounter with the pale, long-necked creature. He started to do some research and asked around about any similar sightings in the area. Jim's curiosity was piqued, and he wanted to know more about what he had witnessed that day. He found out that some locals believed in the existence of a creature called Naga, which was said to have a long neck and could stretch it for reach food or prey. Jim was fascinated by the story and wondered what he had seen, and if it was perhaps the Naga. He started asking around and discovered that several people had reported similar sightings. Some people even claimed to have seen the Naga devouring small animals such as chickens and rabbits in the area. Others believed that the creature was a spirit wandering the fields at night looking for food or prey. Jim's experience became a popular topic of discussion in the area, and many people were curious to know more about the creature that had chased him. Some people believed that Jim's encounter was a warning, while others thought that the Naga might have been attracted to the smell of food that he was carrying. Despite the many theories, nobody could explain why Jim's experience was different from others who had seen the creature. Some people even believed that Jim might have seen a different type of spirit altogether, and it wasn't Naga. As the years went by, Jim's experience remained a mystery, and nobody could provide a satisfactory explanation for what he had seen. However, the story of the Naga became more and more popular, and many people began to believe that the creature was real. Some even started to make offerings of food and incense to the Naga, hoping to appease the spirit and avoid any encounters with it. Jim continued to travel to the city every day, but he never forgot about the strange and terrifying encounter he had experienced years ago. The memory stayed with him for the rest of his life, and he always wondered if he would ever encounter the Naga again. Evil spirits in the creek. So a couple of weeks ago, I was headed out to my family cemetery, about 5 miles outside of town. I hadn't been out there since a couple of days after Christmas, right after I had learned that my dad had finally lost his battle with lung cancer. I've spent a lot of time at the cemetery over the last few years. I like to go out there and do audio recordings, and just for the fact, it's just so peaceful out there. Well, it used to be. I've had some really bad experiences out there in the last couple of years. I have gotten some really nasty EVPs, and it turned into a very dark place at night. But that's a story for another time. Now when I go out there, I always stop at the little country church, about a mile down the road. The reason for this is because the church used to belong to my great-grandfather and my great-uncle, both of whom preached there. And I go there and ask for their protection and guidance before going to the cemetery. But on this night, I changed my pattern for some reason. Instead of going to the church first, I drove on past the cemetery, about a half a mile, to some property that my aunt and uncle own. There's a small creek that runs along the road. Just before you get to the creek is where my life started out, the old homestead. Now at the bottom of the hill over the creek, crosses under a road and makes a sharp turn to continue following the road. In that turn is what used to be a pretty deep hole. My mom and dad grew up right down the road from there, and all of my family used to swim in that hole and fish. Now it's been a very long time since my parents and my uncle even saw me swam there. As a matter of fact, over the years that hole's been filled in, and so no more. Just a shallow bend in the creek. Back in the day, one of my uncle's high school friends drowned there. My uncle also drowned there. They were able to revive him, thank God. So when I arrived there, I backed my truck into the drive. I was barely off the roadway and left my headlights and the motor running. I was only going to be in there for a minute, and I started to record a video on my iPhone, and I was describing why I was going to the cemetery. Now, during all of this, at one point, I thought I saw something pop up from the creek and then go back down really quickly. However, I tried to ignore it and kept going about with my video. After a minute or so, it happened again. I didn't miss a beat and kept on filming, but noted that it appeared to be a figure, human in nature, but grayish white, kind of skinny, but I didn't see a face. Once again, I kept right on going, trying to ignore what I had seen, and then it happened a third time. This time it looked more gray than white, and there was no face, and at that moment, the feeling of something dark, unfriendly, and mad, and I was there. And it was washing over me, and every hair in my body stood straight on end. I started saying, "This isn't good," repeatedly, and then I got the feeling that something aggressive and mad as hell was approaching very quickly. I tried to get out of there as quickly as I could, but it wasn't quick enough. Anyone ever get that some call spirit jumped? It's where a spirit or entity jumps into your body. It's brief most of the time, but not brief enough. Your body goes into survival mode. Adrenaline dumps, but not like a normal adrenaline dump. This is like 10 times worse. It may also feel like your breath is sucked right out of your lungs, and it's a struggle to breathe in any air. It's scary as hell when it happens. You also feel like something evil has reached into your body and grabbed your soul. It's a very demanding warning to get the hell away, and by any means necessary. When I pulled out of there, I headed straight up the road to the church, but before I could get there, I heard a very ominous growl over my left shoulder, and got hit a second time. This time was much worse than the first. I became very vocal and demanded that it get away and out of my truck, but it stayed until I reached the church. When I pulled in, I called upon my great-grandfather to help. Then I was hit a third time. It was brief, but the point was getting across to me. I could feel everything lighten up, as they say. The hairs went down and I became relaxed fairly quickly. I left the church and went back home, where I had my daughter bring out my Bible, and I didn't go inside until I was certain that whatever it was had left me. The next morning I went to the family cemetery, stopping at the church first, of course. I used the necrophonic app, which I use quite a bit from time to time. I didn't even ask about the night before, but I was told that there was evil at the creek. Stay away from the water. They called it dark water. I had never in almost 3 years of using that app ever gotten those responses, or any mentions of water or dark water. And no, I was not under the influence of anything. I take no medications, and other than PTSD, I have no mental health issues. This particular area is pretty rural. The area had a lot of Native American activity, and it's within 300 feet of a known burial ground, as well as another cemetery that had long been forgotten. As a kid, the woods around the area always seemed to have a dark side, but always felt watched when we were playing in the woods around there. There's also a piece of property within a quarter mile that was rumored of being owned by a witch. The Forgotten Voices. So I like to go to cemeteries and walk around, and while doing so, I always record with my iPhone and my digital voice recorder. I find it interesting to see the different styles and types of headstones, as well as the ages of the deceased, and at times when I review my recordings, I get EVPs. This time was no different than any others. This cemetery is from the early 1800s and sits on top of a hill. One side is overlooking a man-made lake, so there's plenty of water to help add to the energy, if you believe that it does or can. So last night I start to review my audio recording. It didn't take long before the next EVP showed up, a faint but clear whisper of help in a male voice. Then as I'm narrating about where the cemetery is located, and that's when I started. And there was no lake there yet, just a valley, another faint EVP that says, "Look," followed by a few seconds later by a male voice saying, "Don't look." Both of these are in different tones. I then say out loud, "Here's a Civil War veteran. He lived until 1933. He was in the Army. I say that I was in the Army too. Thank you for your service." And as I walk, I get, "Come back, soldier," which made the hairs stand up on me. Now the sound of a small plane flying overhead is heard, and I get this EVP in a male voice that says plane. Now I know that I have a definite intelligent spirit with me. Then I come to this smaller headstone of a 9-year-old girl. I'm going to call her Clarissa. On the top above her name was a picture of a stork flying and carrying a baby. I found it very sad, the pain that these parents must have went through. I'm a father of 6, all grown now, but it has always been my worst fear to lose a child. But as I'm describing her headstone and age, I say hello to her. Then in a female tone, I get this EVP. "Leave here." And a split second, another one in a male voice. "Dickhead." Maybe the mother and father? Then I come to another Civil War veteran. I'm going to call him Benjamin Suttles, who served with a COD 4th Ohio Cavalry. As soon as I said his name, there is a male voice that clearly says, "It was the war." Then over the course of the next 3 minutes and 25 seconds, I hear my name, Clinton, said in the same voice 4 times with a forceful whisper of "listen," thrown in 1 time in the same male tone of voice. At the end, I get out of the car to open the gate to leave, and as I'm opening the gate, it's inside the car still recording, and I get what sounds like a couple of hideous-sounding growls. Now, before someone says, "Well, you're near a lake, so it's probably voices of people out in boats," that's not the case. The temperature when I was there was the mid-40s with a stiff breeze and a wind chill lower to 40s and upper 30s. There were no boats out on the lake, and there's no one close to there to fish in the bank, and no parking areas near me. One side of the cemetery is the lake, the rest is the woods except for a narrow one-lane road, which is not used much until summer, and the sun had already set, and it was almost complete darkness. As I said, I use my phone for my video, and I use my old Sony ICD BX112 voice recorder. It's old as dirt, basically, but it's very sensitive and reliable. Only downfall is that there's no card to save it onto, so I log everything on paper when I review it. I go to a large number of cemeteries to do this. I don't do what everybody calls EVP sessions. I just record as I walk around and talk or ask questions. An incident at a cemetery very close to my home in 2019 got me into doing this. I've gotten some things that sound absolutely horrific or demonic. Pleas for help, and even threats of bodily harm. I've been called by my childhood nickname numerous times, and they even told me of my father's upcoming death. It wasn't 100% accurate, but it was so close that I can't ignore it. I'm still somewhat skeptical, but that's slowly wearing off. This stuff is out there, and it's very real. Too real sometimes. Vehement atheist turned moderately spiritual after my mom's passing. My mom had battled cancer for over 9 years. We never had a great relationship, but while it was tumultuous, I would never argue that she was a strong lady. She started declining really fast a couple of months before my wedding, and to our surprise, she ended up making it to it. She was frail and under 100 pounds and still got her ass on the dance floor. She went into hospice on Monday. She was tough to convince that it was time for hospice, but when she lost most bodily functions and was in too much pain, she just finally agreed. She was coherent, although tired. I worked from home, so I had been in and out of hospice that week, as work permitted. Every day seemed like it was the last, no change and still coherent. Thursday came around and I was sitting at my computer when I suddenly got this overwhelming feeling that I needed to go to hospice. I shrugged, called my coworker, and told her. She immediately said, "If you feel this, you need to go now." I rolled my eyes, assuming it was just anxiety. I decided I'd get ready to leave anyway, since it was a slow work day. As I'm getting ready, my other coworker, practically a surrogate mother, called me and asked how I was. I told her about the feeling, and she basically echoed what my cousin said, but added, "That's weird. I just finished praying for you and hoping you'd make it to the right decision." I just felt called. At this point, I was like, what the fuck? So I get my laptop bag, and just as I'm walking out the door, my phone rings again. This time it's my dad. He sounds somber and says, "It's time. The death rattle has started." She doesn't have much time. So I get in my car and fly to the hospice. I get there, meet with my family, and spend time alone with her saying my goodbyes. I got there probably a little bit before noon, and she passed away before 2. I was shook apart from the trauma of watching my mother die, and the feeling I got that told me that I was going to go, and was so outrageous to me. I realized there's a likelihood that even though our relationship was rocky, we were connected. She always had this weird mom instinct to check in whenever I was home alone, even when she had no idea I was alone. Fast forward a few months and her sister calls me and says some creepy shit happened to another cousin of mine. I'll preface this by saying both my mother and this cousin had partners that were notoriously cheaters. Recently, this cousin's husband had cheated, and my cousin made the decision to stay with her husband. My aunt called me to tell her that months after my mother's death, my cousin got a text from my mother that said, "He never changed." I was floored. I couldn't even, and I still can't to this day. I try to tell myself that both of these things have logical explanations, but it's just so bizarre. When I was in college, I worked at a little gas station in the middle of nowhere in Alabama, and it was open pretty late. It was a great job because after 10, we really had no one that came in, so I could turn on music and just work on my homework. One night, a little after midnight, I was getting ready to count down the register and pack up my things. I went to the office and back, and proceeded to start counting money when I noticed a heavy-set guy standing at the counter. looking at the wall of cigarettes behind it. I figured I must have forgotten to lock the door, so I walk out to apologize, only to find that no one's there. I figured maybe the camera wasn't working, so I shrugged it off, and I walked around the store. I also checked the door, and it wasn't locked, so I locked it. I went back to the office. Nothing on the camera screen, so I go back to counting down. A few minutes later, I look up at the screen again, and the dude is still there. And now he's standing with his back to the camera, pressed up against the beer fridge. I walked back out, now firmly shitting bricks. As I was a tiny woman and far away from literally everything and everyone, no one was there. I was terrified. I grabbed a can of wasp spray and searched literally every inch of the store while trying to call my boyfriend at the time to drive out there. He was sadly too drunk to do so and said, "You're probably fine," before hanging up. I summoned the remaining courage that I had and went back to the office. Locking that door behind me as I did before, I hurried through, counting everything again. Looking back up at the screen one more time, I saw the same dude standing there and looking at the office door where I was. He was perfectly still and not moving, but just standing there. I quickly finished counting the money down, threw it in the safe, and pretty much ran out of the store, not shutting off the lights behind me. The next morning, probably about 4 a.m., I was called by my boss asking me to open the store because he had felt a family emergency. The extra money was also nice, so I agreed, but asked if I could bring my friend with me, since it had only been about an hour or two and I told him what had happened the night before. "Oh, you saw him, huh?" "Yeah, go ahead. He scares me too." An invisible person in the washroom. I was in a towering commercial building yesterday, on one of the upper floors, when I suddenly had the urge to use the washroom. I looked around, but I couldn't find any washrooms nearby, so I decided to ask one of the office employees if there was a washroom nearby that I could use. One of the employees offered me and lended a key card that they would unlock the washroom on the same floor. I thanked her and headed off. When I arrived at the washroom, I was struck by its small size. It had only 3 stalls and 2 sinks, and the walls were a drab shade of gray that seemed to suck all the light out of the room. I headed for the stall furthest from the door, hoping to find some privacy. But as soon as I entered the washroom, I saw a woman walk out from the first stall and head to the sink to wash her hands. I didn't want to use the stall right after her, so I quickly headed for the third stall, hoping it would be cleaner. As I locked the stall door, I felt a creeping sense of unease. The stall was dark and cramped and smelt faintly of mold and decay. When I lifted the toilet seat, I was greeted by a nauseating sight. The bowl was filled with a thick, slimy substance that seemed to be moving on its own accord. I quickly decided to move to the second stall, hoping it would be cleaner. As I walked out of the third stall, I saw the woman still washing her hands at the sink. She glanced in my direction and said, "Catherine, you done yet?" I was confused. My name wasn't Catherine. But before I could say anything, I heard a voice from the third stall say, "Not yet. Maybe you should head back to the office first." My blood ran cold as I realized what had just happened. There was someone in the third stall, someone who had spoken to the woman as if they knew her. But I had checked all 3 stalls, and they had all been empty. I quickly finished using the washroom and left as fast as I could, my mind racing with questions and fear. As I stepped out of the washroom, I listened carefully for a sound of someone entering or leaving the washroom, but there was only silence. The washroom door had to be unlocked with a card when entering or leaving, which made a loud beep sound, but I heard nothing. It was as if the person in the third stall had never been there at all. The whole experience left me shaken and afraid, wondering what other horrors might be lurking in that commercial building. Did you ever encounter places where you suddenly feel anxiety every time you're there? As I reflect on my past travels through the streets of my old city, I can't help but recall the numerous times I felt an overwhelming sense of terror and anxiety while passing through certain areas. It didn't matter what time of year it was, or what the weather was like, the feeling was always the same. I remember one particular spot, just a small stretch of road that couldn't have been more than 30 meters in length. It was situated in an otherwise normal district, with no obvious signs of danger or ominous history. And yet, every time I walked down that street, I was filled with an inexplicable dread that made me want to run as fast as I could in the opposite direction. It wasn't just that one spot, there were others as well. Some were larger, encompassing entire blocks of houses, while others were more isolated. No matter where I went, it seemed like there was always some place that triggered that same sense of unease and fear within me. I tried to find an explanation for it, researching the history of various neighborhoods and scouring old maps for any clues, but there was nothing to suggest that these areas were any different from the rest of the city. No cemeteries, no ancient ruins, no evidence of alien activity, nothing that could explain the overwhelming sense of dread that I felt. One of my friends told me that she always felt uneasy at a particular subway station, which I later discovered had been built right in the middle of a medieval cemetery. But even there, I didn't experience the same feeling of terror that I did in those seemingly innocuous parts of the city. It was as if there was some unseen force lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce on anyone who dared to cross its path. And no matter how hard I tried to shake the feeling, it followed me wherever I went. Even now, years later, the memory of those terrifying spots still haunt me. I can't help but wonder what dark secrets they might be hiding. Once, I encountered an apple out of nowhere. It was a dark and eerie night in the park that covered several square miles, with forests, hills, and ravines. The moon was the only source of light, casting an ominous glow over the desolate landscape. It was so quiet that the only sound that could be heard was the crunching of leaves underfoot. The protagonist, having lived in the area all their life, knew the park like the back of their hand. They had spent countless hours exploring every inch of it during their childhood, and as an adult, they often visited the park at night for a leisurely walk after a long day at work. After they were walking down one of the alleys, the protagonist suddenly heard something moving in the grass. At first glance, they assumed it was a field mouse or some other small creature scurrying about, but as they drew closer, they realized it was an apple, a small wild apple that looked unappetizing and unremarkable. But there was something odd about this apple, something that made the protagonist's heart race. They knew the park like the back of their hand, and they were certain there were no apple trees or wild apples in this particular part of the park. The closest apple trees were half a mile away, and they had never seen an apple in this area before. As the protagonist picked up the apple, they could feel a sense of unease creeping up their spine. There was no logical explanation for this apple's presence, and it was making them feel uneasy. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the park, rustling the leaves and causing the protagonist to shiver. The apple seemed to glow in the moonlight, causing an eerie light on the protagonist's face. They looked around, but there was no one around for miles. The park was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was as if the world had frozen in time, and the protagonist was the only one left in this desolate wasteland. They decided to take the apple home with them, determined to investigate its origin. But as they left the park and entered their home, they noticed that the apple seemed to be getting heavier and heavier with every step. Once they reached their home, they placed the apple on the kitchen counter and went to bed, hoping to get a good night's sleep. But the apple seemed to be calling out to them, its presence growing more and more ominous with every passing hour. When the protagonist woke up the next morning, they discovered that the apple had disappeared without a trace. There was no sign of it on the counter and no explanation for its disappearance. The protagonist decided to return to the park to investigate further, but as they reached the area where they had found the apple, they realized that something was terribly wrong. The trees were twisted and gnarled, and the ground was barren and lifeless. It was as if the apple had been the harbinger of something sinister, and its disappearance had unleashed an evil force that had taken over the park. The protagonist had stumbled upon something supernatural, something that had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for his chance to strike. From that day on, the protagonist avoided the park, knowing that something evil had taken root there. They had witnessed firsthand the power of the supernatural, and they knew that they had been lucky to escape with their life. car right behind, then nothing at all. Ghost car? One dark and quiet night, I found myself driving home alone on a deserted road in downtown Tulsa. It was around 2 a.m, and I was the only one on the road. That is until I noticed another car, a grayish-black one, driving erratically in front of me. As I got closer, I realized the car was all over the road, and I needed to pass it. Finally, the car moved into the right lane, and I began to pass. As I passed the car, I got a good look at it. It was a strange vehicle with a black tinted window that looked ominous in the darkness. Suddenly, the car's brights came on, and then it began to follow me, staying uncomfortably close. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, and I started to panic. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the car vanished from my rearview mirror, leaving me completely alone on the deserted road. I couldn't believe my eyes. How could a car be right behind me 1 minute and then disappear without a trace the next? There were no exit lines for miles, and I couldn't fathom how the car could have turned off the road so quickly. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a ghost car, a figment of my imagination, or something more sinister? I made it home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. For weeks after, I couldn't drive that stretch of road without feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I still wonder what happened that night and what the driver of that strange car wanted with me. You want a campfire tale? I've one for you and your friends. As a child, my parents always took me camping. We'd pack up the car and head out to the local campsites in Oklahoma and Missouri. Those were some of my fondest memories. Late nights spent huddled around the campfire with my parents and their friends, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. But as I got older, I began to hear tales that would make my blood run cold. One night when I was around 12 years old, my dad and his friends told me about a blind man who would wander the campsites at night. They said he couldn't see anything, but if he saw a flame, he would make his way towards it. The story goes that if you're sitting around a campfire at night, you may look back to see someone in the distance making their way towards your campsite. At first, I thought it was just a silly ghost story, something to scare the kids, but as the night wore on, the fire burned low. I began to feel a sense of unease creeping up on me. It was as if someone was watching us, lurking just behind the circle of light cast by the fire. And then I heard it, a soft shuffling sound like footsteps in the dirt. I turned to look, but there was no one there. I tried to brush it off as just my imagination, but then I saw something out the corner of my eye, a figure, barely visible, but in the darkness making its way towards us. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as the figure drew closer and closer, and then I saw it, or rather the lack of it. This person had no eyes, just empty sockets staring back at me. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat as the figure reached out to touch me. I don't remember much after that. My parents said that I must have just had a nightmare. But I know what I saw, and now whenever I'm camping and sitting around a campfire, I can't help but feel like something's watching me. Something just beyond the light of the flames, waiting to reach out and grab me. So be warned, my friend. The next time you're sitting around the fire, keep an eye out. What you hear may not be just the wind. Was it an angel? Years ago when I was 2, I lost my mother due to cancer. A couple days later, we lost my grandpa on my father's side. And to top it all off, I almost lost my dad due to a train accident. I don't remember much of this time in my life, even though I'm told I should. The little I remember is from the accident when my father was able to come home. I remember him having burns in several parts of his body. I can still see some burn scars on his arms. And Dad often wouldn't play with me because he was in pain, but he would try his best to give me attention anyway. But he'd often say that I was his little princess and that he would never ever leave me, and that even death could never force him to abandon me. Since I don't remember anything for the rest of the story is what I was told by multiple family members. My father is and has always been a truck driver and has gone to multiple states, so we would often leave for extended periods of time. After my mother and grandpa died, he decided to take a break in order to look after me and my mom and mourn the loved ones we lost. Even though he wanted to stay at home, he he couldn't. He had to work in order to support me and my grandma on the father's side, who had just lost her husband. I'm told that the day he was leaving, I clung to his leg even though I didn't say anything. I was told that after everything that had happened, I didn't speak and my bad nail-biting habits began. I wouldn't let him go until my grandpa pried me off and took me to watch TV. As soon as he closed the door, I ran to the window and watched him leave with tears in my eyes. My father was already driving the truck when he approached the train tracks. The warnings, bars, lights, they weren't on and the bars weren't up. So he drove through when suddenly the red light began blinking. The bars lowered, which didn't allow him to drive the truck to the other side, and he heard the train coming and the blowing of its whistle. Before he could get out, it was too late and the train hit the truck. He recalls, for that moment, it was like his soul left his body because he remembers being high up and seeing how the train railed the truck and how his body was still in there. After that, he said everything went dark and he could only hear my mother and my grandpa telling him to wake up. He slowly opened his eyes and swears that for that moment, he saw my mother and grandpa standing in front of him. He was in a helicopter which was taking him to the hospital, and he said he couldn't move at all, and he only heard the people in the helicopter saying that it was a miracle he was still alive, but that he may not have much time left after he had blanketed out. In the following days in the hospital, my uncle says that a gentle old man would come almost daily, dropping off food or clothes for my father. My father only met this elderly man a couple of times, but he says that he was really nice and gentle. On the last day my father was in the hospital, the old man told my uncle that this was the last time he would come visit because my father was due to go home soon. The old man wrote down his name and phone number on a piece of paper napkin and went on his way home. A couple of days passed and my father, already home, without telling him, my uncle decided to call the old man and thank him for his kindness. My uncle recalls, almost verbatim, the conversation went like this. Calls the number the old man gave him. Young lady picks up. Uncle. Hello, is this so-and-so's phone number? Young lady. Hi, yes, this was his phone number. Can I help you? Oh, I just wanted to thank him for helping my brother out while he recovered in the hospital. Young lady. Sir, are you sure? Said his name was so-and-so. Uncle. Yes, I'm positive. He even wrote his name and phone number on a piece of paper so I wouldn't forget. Young lady. So, sir. And so was my late father. He passed away years ago in an accident. That's impossible. My wife and the rest of my family spoke with. So did my brother. Young lady. I don't see how that's possible. He's been dead for years now. After that, my uncle finished speaking with the young lady, said his goodbyes, and hung up. To this day, no one's really sure why that kind old man chose to help my dad or how it's even possible. My bonus mom, stepmom, believes it was an angel who wanted to help my dad. However, my aunt believes that it was just a spirit who didn't want the same thing that happened to him to happen to my father. What do y'all think? The figure on the cove. In Ireland, you're never far from the sea. I'm very used to my proximity to the water. In a way, I imagine many of you aren't due to simply geography. I was born on the north coast of Ireland, technically in Northern Ireland, near Ballycastle, a small town up there. Like most coastal towns, our part of the world comes alive in the summer with people from all over, but in the winter, it's quite barren and isolated. Unlike most people, it was that time of the year in the beginning and late autumn and running through the middle of spring that I enjoy sea the most. There's something quite special about having access to sprawling beaches when most people don't bother to give them a chance. Even on dull days, the roar of the sea in all of its expanse calms me, particularly at dawn or dusk when the light of the sky makes the water glimmer with a mystery that I can't characterize. My story begins and ends with the sea. Before I really begin, I'd like to give you a brief rundown of Selkie or Silkie lore. Selkies are a type of being who, legend has it, inhabit the sea around the northern British Isles. although they can be traced as far as Iceland. The sea north of Ireland is inhabited by seals, and it isn't uncommon to see a colony of seals or perhaps an individual further out in the towns. I don't know if there exists an animal more charming than a seal, with its lively bark and its smiling face, so like that of a human. The selkie takes the form of a seal, but is really being with the ability to remove its coat and take on a human-like form. Traditionally, tales speak of selkies appearing as beautiful women, but if you delve deep into folklore, selkies appear in all kinds of human forms. Legend has it that they appear in groups in moonlit beaches at certain times during the year, far from human eyes. Here they will remove their seal coats and take on their human bodies, dancing with jubilance to music under the light of the moon before eventually returning to the sea. It sounds like a very innocent myth, but there is a much darker side to the selkie. Ireland isn't a large country, and so relatively speaking, you can never be too far from humanity and civilization. If misfortune strikes and human catch a sight of a group of selkies, they'll dart into the coasts and make their way back to the sea without hesitation. If, however, the human takes hold of one of the coats, their skin, then the selkie is bound to him. The selkie cannot return without this. Consequently, stories tell of man taking selkies as wives, keeping the sealskin hidden away. The selkie will never stop longing for its home and family, but it'll be trapped in the home of their captor for the remainder of their lives until they're able to recapture their lost coat. Most would never succeed in doing so. Like most myths, I would have always taken selkies with a pinch of salt. That is until I was 17 and had my own experience that was really unexplainable unless you place some credence on selkie lore. As I say, I was born on the coast, just outside of town. Teenage life can be challenging for anyone, but for me, this was amplified by being a queer person in a very small community. It wasn't easy, but I found some solace in nature, which, as I said, provided me with headspace at a time when I needed it more than anything. Ironically, the best tonic for my sense of isolation was isolation. A self-built isolation on those evenings when I could walk 10 minutes to the beach and enjoy the setting sun, which made the water glisten with hope and that unexplainable sense of mystery. I spent hours down there, particularly on those cold days when contact with other people would be minimal. Mostly there wouldn't be much to say about those evenings. I would walk and walk and walk and walk and eventually begin to switch off. Not terribly exciting, but steady and constant. There was one evening, however, when my path took a different turn. There was a section on the beach that was somewhat shrouded by dunes and rocks, a quiet cove a few miles down from the side of the beach I started at. We were deep in spring at this point. I know this because I never could have made it that far along the sand in the winter months when daylight was minimal. I was trying to maximize my time here before the tourist season began and the area would begin to fill with people from all over. On the beach, I was stricken by the sight of what looked like a young man. The light was beginning to dim, and the sea had a purply hue. He was strewn out in the sand, his form slender and somehow gentle. It would have been somewhat unusual to see someone this far out on the beach at this time of year, but not altogether shocking. What was shocking was that he was entirely naked, with not a single item of clothing in sight, either on his body or on the sand. And I'll inform you now that although winter had ended, an Irish spring is hardly warm. It isn't rare for snow to fall as late as March or April, and the wind, particularly by the sea, is biting, at times relentless. You can understand my shock then, seeing this naked figure on the beach that day. What made it more bewildering was that his body appeared to glimmer. It was as though he was formed from matter related to the sea before us, which gleamed in much the same way as pale skin imitated its hue, moving softly with the sun to create something that transfixed me. I'd just have been deeply embarrassed by anything related to nudity or sex. I was an awkward 17-year-old from rural Ireland, but this was different in the same way that the sea, this day, was calming and soothed me. It was as though he was inspired by the same effect, though somehow magnified. I lost track of the time spent in that spot, and I'm embarrassed to write now that I stood staring at what I thought was a naked man for an amount of time, but I can only be honest. And then it was over. He opened his eyes suddenly and appeared to become stiff in a way that contrasted, until then, relaxed form. I saw him turn his eyes to me, which widened in shock. These eyes, I remember, were striking, even from a slight distance. They were gray, but startling so, almost sinking into the whiteness that surrounded them like watercolor piercing, despite the lack of hue. His entire form was one pale, glistening shape that melded together and appeared translucent in the dimming light. He quickly and soundlessly rose to his feet and moved with a sharp fluidity to the rocks behind him. Still frozen, I watched as he emerged from the rocks, carrying what looked like a silvery piece of cloth, which matched his own body. I say cloth, but it didn't move in the wind, which was blowing in from the sea. It seemed solid and heavy, but he carried it effortlessly to the sea at a fast pace, eyes staring intently at me the entire time. When he reached the sea, he stepped into the water with that coat and buried himself into the waves, and then he was gone. At this, I shook myself back to life and moved toward the shore myself. Much as I tried, I couldn't make out his form anywhere. He had vanished into the roaring boundlessly without any physical trace. I was bemused but exhilarated. I remained there for around 10 minutes more before making my own way home. The images of the evening etched into my mind for the duration of the walk, which was guided by the light of the now fully risen moon. My parents were frustrated when I reached my house, upset that I had been out for much longer than I had expected, but their words seemed to drift over my head. I was a quiet teenager, and I imagined I wasn't surprised to them that I didn't have much to say, so no matter their frustration. I didn't speak to anyone at the time about what I had encountered on that evening. Being a bit of an outcast already, I hardly wanted to appear even odder. But it would be a few years before I really found a group of friends with whom I could mull these thoughts over with. I did, however, spend the next weeks burying myself in online literature about anything that might have been connected to the image on the figure on the beach. I came across Selkie stories and immersed myself in Selkie lore. Although it didn't entirely match what I had seen, it was the only mythos I could find that was somewhat similar. I returned to that part of the beach many times, especially in summer when daylight was much more generous. It saddened me that it never came across as being that I had seen it at night. On one occasion, however, I had resigned myself to walking back home when I heard a bark coming from the shore. I was delighted to see 3 silvery seals in the water, a few meters out into the sea. They moved playfully, their voices filling the air. It struck me that one, little smaller than the other 2, was looking at me watchfully, small eyes intent. The light of the setting sun hit its body, which sparkled with its rays, and I smiled back, waving slightly. I don't know if this was the being I had seen that evening some months before. It may have been, or it may have just been an ordinary, albeit beautiful seal. What I do know is that I didn't want to disturb him or frighten him, so after waving, I began my walk home. I pray that whoever or whatever he was, he knows now that I meant him no harm, and when I encountered him, I enjoyed the evening light on the cove. Rather, I would love to be able to communicate with him. How much seeing him meant to me, and how much peace it brought to my mind seeing one other creature enjoying the glory and beauty of nature on a spring evening in Ireland. Heard a little girl crying for help near our pond. Well, tonight I was outside with my cousin, helping him set up for his new basketball hoop. We got finished with it, and he was shooting some hoops while I was watching it, and it's about dusk. Then he asks me if I want to go inside. I say sure, and then all of a sudden I hear, "Help me, please help me, someone please help me." It sounded like a little girl crying for help near a pond. I was shaking, and my cousin had already went inside the door, but it was waiting for me. At this point, I'm shaking because it's almost like I knew what it was as soon as I heard it. My cousin came back out, and I no longer heard it. Then I'm shaking my way back inside and tell my fiancée, and she looks out from the bathroom window because it's looking out towards the pond, and she sees a little girl out there. Then she tells me to come, and look not even 10 seconds later, and there's nothing there. What the hell is happening? First it was knocking and howling. We're having actual experiences. I'm seriously terrified. I checked for any sign of an actual little girl, and there's no sign of anyone having been down there. So for all you that say stupid shit because I didn't go down there and help the little girl, stop. It wasn't a real little girl, and I know it wasn't. I know who lives around this area and I know what happens around here. It's just not some distressed kid, I promise. I've been reading up skinwalkers and also thinking about them. I'm about 60% native and also just had a child. Lots of negative things are going on in the family right now. It's chaotic and it's feeding off of these things. This wants a little girl that was kidnapped or anything like that. My fiance, say her out by the pond or the grass, she couldn't have fell in 10 seconds and there was no sign. There was no splashing in the water, no ripples, and also when I checked this morning, there were no footprints or hair, shoes, clothes, anything. It was muddy enough to see if someone had been there last night. I'm going to start catching all this on camera so all the people who are anal and calling me names will see what I mean. It's just a nightmare, right? Around 2 years ago now, I was working in landscaping, which means I woke up at 5 a.m. and I was at work by 6. Sometimes my now fiancé would spend the night with me for no particular reason other than to spend the night. And one morning I woke up and got ready for work and left. Everything seemed normal, just another early morning. Around 1 p.m. I got a call from my fiancé asking where I was. I was really confused, but I told her I'm at work like always. She questioned me and asked if I'd gone in late or something, to which I told her, nope, left just like always. She then tells me that she vividly remembered me coming up, going into bed and crawling in with her, saying I wasn't feeling good and that I was going to take the day off. She questioned me and I put my arm around her. We both drifted off to sleep. That didn't happen, and I chalked it up to her having a weird, vivid dream. About 2.5 months later, the same circumstances, I get another frantic call at around 7 a.m. My fiancée is not a morning person, and she'll usually fall asleep until noon. She has the day off, so I was immediately wondering what happened. She tells me that it happened again, only this time when I went in to get into bed with her. She said, "You're not hot sauce." I don't want to give out my real name, hope you all understand. To which whatever was posing as me gets angry and says, "How did you know?" This freaked her out, and she said she suddenly felt like she was in danger, so she finally sat up and looked towards where the voice came from and realized nothing was there. I eventually managed to calm her down and convinced that it was just a bad nightmare or something. We talked later that night, and she says that whatever it was felt dangerous. I am a believer in the paranormal, but had lived in this particular apartment for about 2 years at this point, and I'd never experienced anything. The next day, she decided to stay the night again, since I didn't have to go to work, and she felt safer sleeping with me that night due to the previous morning. I agreed, and we went to bed like normal. That night around 3 a.m., I'd woken up to use the bathroom. Still half asleep, I do my thing, and suddenly the curtain to my shower flies open. I'm not talking about moving a little either. I mean like it was completely closed and suddenly it was pushed all the way to the other side, showing the shower to me. I immediately awake and aware now and jump out of the bathroom, stand there for a few seconds almost waiting for something else to happen, but nothing ever did. I didn't go back to sleep that night, and I told my fiancée about what had happened. When she woke up, a few other small things happened after this too, but I'll end this here to see what y'all think of this. I'm honestly still confused about it to this day, and I never really understood what was going on for the rest of the time that I lived in that room. I grew up in the rural mining town in British Columbia. When I was a kid in the early 90s, I had a friend whose father, a doctor, resided in a large home in my neighborhood. The home, originally built for a wealthy mining contractor, was one of the first ones built in the community. The property was large, containing not only the house, but a surrounding private forest, an old mining shack, and a small house for what might be assumed to be servants or guests. It's hard to put into words the size of this forest. Despite being in the heart of the community, you could easily lose yourself in it. In part because it was a prime location for my childhood antics, my friends and I would play fight, hold adventures, and use it as a playground. Nevertheless, we never went in there alone. It's true for most forests that, especially at night, they can often seem foreboding or scary to kids. But despite that, I felt like there was something really off about it, even during daylight hours. The few times we weren't playing and sat silent within it, the forest itself would be unnaturally quiet. It had that foreboding feeling, like a calm before the storm, where we'd get a tense anxiety about the location. As kids, it was something we'd brush off and move on from and try to forget. Forward many years, the family of a friend who lived in that house moved away. I worked as a page in a local library then. One task involved was cataloging the local newspaper collection we had available and making sure that it was in order. Sometimes curiosity would get the better of me, and I'd sit there reading some of the more fascinating stories that would make the town's top headlines. And then one in particular stood out. I wish I remembered the details. It would have been nice to find again. Back in the late 60s, the teenager son of a wealthy contractor who owned that property went missing walking home from high school. Witnesses recall seeing him walking along the road and into the forest surrounding his home. One witness in particular remembered saying goodbye as she went into a different direction as he entered the forest. He never left the forest. His body was never found. The only evidence the police ever found was a bloodied blanket in an old mining shack owned by a hunter who resided close to the property. Something is jumping on my bed. What is it and why? As I lay down in my bed, a feeling of unease washes over me. I can sense that something is not quite right. Despite feeling exhausted, I'm hesitant to close my eyes and drift off to sleep. Just as I'm starting to doze off, I feel a sudden pressure on my head. I try to ignore it, but the sensation persists. It feels like something is jumping out of my bed and settling down beside my knees. At first, I think it might be my imagination, simply playing tricks on me. But the weight is too heavy for that. I can feel the entity's breath on my skin, but when I look down, there's nothing there. This is not the first time this has happened, but it's becoming more frequent. I have no pets, so I can't explain the presence of this unseen creature. It is larger than a cat, possibly the size of a fox. Despite my fear, I can't help but feel a strange sense of comfort when this creature visits me. It seems to lull me into a peaceful sleep, but the thought of an unknown entity lying beside me in bed is terrifying. I try to rationalize it, thinking it's maybe my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I know that something is there. Something I can't see, but can feel. And the idea of that something could be there is enough to make me never want to sleep again. Weird noise, weird things happening. As I sit here in my living room, the weight of the unknown pressing down on me, I can't help but wonder what lurks in the shadows of my home. For years, I've moved from one house to another, hoping to escape the inexplicable phenomena that seem to follow me. But every time, the horrors only seem to intensify. In this latest home, I initially felt like I had found a sanctuary, perhaps. The atmosphere was calm and uneventful, and I'd hoped that perhaps, just maybe, the nightmare was finally over. However, it wasn't long before the strange happenings began to manifest themselves once again. At first, it was the occasional sound of footsteps that I would hear while I was at home alone. I tried to brush it off, telling maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the footsteps only grew louder and more persistent. Then came the orbs. Every time I reviewed the security footage, I would see these eerie balls of light dancing around the house, their movements seeming almost purposeful. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me and studying me, but the worst was yet to come. One night I was woken by the sound of something cracking in the darkness. It was so loud that I thought it was a gunshot at first. But when I looked around, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I was paralyzed by a sudden and overwhelming sense of dread. Then, in the corner of my eye, I saw a dark shape moving. It was like a black spot, a shadow that slithered through the room with an eerie grace. I tried to focus on it to get a better look, but every time I turned to face it, it was gone. That's when the smell hit me. It was a putrid stench that filled my nostrils like the smell of rotting eggs. It was so intense that I could taste it, and I gagged on the fumes. I don't know how long it lasted, but it felt like an eternity before it finally dissipated. I don't know what to do. I don't know what any of this means. But what I do know is that I'm not alone in this house. Something is here with me, something that I can't see or touch, but I can feel its presence, and it's getting stronger every day. Shadow over my shoulder. As I reminisce on that dreadful day, I shudder with fear after all these years. It was the week after my granddad's sudden death, and the air in the house felt heavy with grief. I was sitting in the front living room, flipping through a book, trying to distract myself from the sorrow that engulfed the entire family. The room was silent, except for the sound of pages turning. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow figure. First, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but then it moved. It was leaning over the sofa, peering over my shoulders as if reading the book with me. It was a two-dimensional shadow, like a human-shaped cutout, but blacker than the darkest night. My heart pounding, I froze with fear, unable to move or scream. The shadow figure was so close to me, and yet it had no substance or form. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, but it was real. It was as if the shadow had become to life, and it was just watching me. I summoned the courage to look up, and in that moment, I saw the most terrifying thing I'd ever witnessed. The shadow figure moved, darting down the far wall at an unnatural speed, and disappeared through a closed door leading to the hallway. As I sat there, my mind racing with fear, I realized that something otherworldly was in the house with me. The thought of being alone in the house with this malevolent force was just too much to bear. I bolted out of the room, ran up the stairs, and locked myself in my room for the rest of the night. That experience still haunts me to this day, and I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I had not seen the shadow figure and had continued reading my book. Dream visitation. I was always incredibly close with my grandfather. He was a hero to me, and he took me in when I was about 14 years old. He taught me how to drive, how to shave, how to fish, basically everything a person needs to know to survive in this world. In the spring of 2016, his health began to deteriorate. His heart was failing. On a sunny Tuesday in May, his great big heart finally stopped. It was a good death, but it was hard on me. About a year after his death, I was working nights and spent most of the day asleep. One day I woke to my cell phone ringing. Being half asleep, I didn't bother to look at the screen to see who was calling. I just answered it. Hello? Cody, how are you? It was clearly my grandfather's voice. I'm fine, Grandpa. How are you? It was then that my mind finally caught up and I remembered that he was dead. As soon as the thought entered my mind, the phone hung up. I quickly forced myself from the semi to full consciousness state. I found myself holding my phone in my hand. The screen was on and it was unlocked. I opened my recent calls to see who or what there was on an incoming call, but there wasn't any. I didn't know what to make of the situation. I know I heard his voice. And why would I be holding the phone? The rational me wanted to think that it was just grief that manifested into subconscious actions of a phone call. But I also wanted to think that Grandpa was trying to reach out. A few weeks later, I looked up others that were speaking about their deceased loved ones through dreams or had phantom phone calls. And I discovered that phantom phone calls are relatively rare, but when it happens while you're asleep, it's dream visitation. The theory is that when you're dreaming, it's easier for a spirit to pierce that veil and communicate. I know how true that is, but occasionally I'll dream about Grandfather. I always wake up hoping that he's still out there somewhere. My cat visited me tonight. As the night grew darker, I brought my cat into my room and placed him gently on the ground. As I turned around to leave, something caught my attention. The sounds of his paws scraping against the surface of my dresser drawers. The same way my old cat used to do it when he was still with us. My heart skipped a beat as I watched him, puzzled and confused. Suddenly he became agitated and started to claw at my bed, his eyes fixated on something invisible to my human eyes. I searched the room frantically, trying to find the source of his terror, but there was nothing there. It was just like he was chasing a phantom. Suddenly, my cat stopped moving and his eyes met mine. It was then that I felt a cold and eerie presence on my hand, as if a ghostly entity was gently rubbing its cheek against my fingers. I could hardly believe it, but it was like the spirit of my deceased cat was still with me. My cat continued to stare into the void, and I realized that he was seeing something that I couldn't. It was like he was watching the ghostly apparition of my old cat running around my room, taunting him with its presence. My heart was pounding in my chest as I watched the scene unfold before me. As I looked down at my cat, I could see that he wasn't just staring blankly, he was actually communicating with the ghostly presence. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but it was like they were having a conversation in a language that only they could understand. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I realized that there was something truly supernatural happening in my room. I couldn't explain it, but it was like my old cat's spirit was still with me, watching over me and my feline companion. As the night drew on, I could feel the presence of the ghostly cat getting stronger and stronger, till it was almost overwhelming. I knew that I had to do something to try and make it go away, but I didn't know how. Eventually, my cat calmed down, and the ghostly presence faded away into nothingness. But the memory of that terrifying night stayed with me for a long time, haunting me with its supernatural power and its intensity. The Thing at the Abandoned School. I was talking with friends earlier and decided to share here too. Me and my friend group will go to abandoned buildings to explore them. We've been to factories, mills, hospitals, schools, homes, and even an underground power facility. It's fun. One night, our planner in the group found a school that was shut down in early 2000s due to poor structural integrity. While doing some more digging, we discovered that there was a murder there not long after the school shut down, and the body was never found. That didn't stop us. We still went out because ghosts aren't real, right? Well, that's what I thought. That's what we all thought before we stepped into that school. Come the night of our expedition, we struggled to get everyone in the door because only 2 out of 4 of us could fit through the broken door. That was me and my buddy Chris. Seeing how me and Chris were already inside, we decided to glance around the place and see what we could find. While walking through the classroom, Chris tells me he's going to let the girls, the other 2, know that we can't get everyone in this time around. I said okay, and stayed behind because I don't usually scare easily. While in this classroom, I walk towards a shared closet and start feeling uneasy. I tell myself it's just dark and I'm alone now. I make my way into the closet, and just as I'm about to step into the other classroom, I get this strong feeling like I shouldn't go in there. I've never felt something like that, and I decided to trust my gut feeling. Right as I'm leaving, it feels like someone's behind me, and I start to hear this tapping on a metal desk. And the tapping gets faster and more violent, almost like someone tapping their fingers. I ran the fuck out of there. My friends all got a good laugh and we left. But I need answers. What made that tapping? Why did I have those feelings? If ghosts aren't real, then what was that? I literally couldn't sleep at night. I convinced my friends that we should go back. The next weekend came around and we were back, except this time, we brought the right tools to get everyone in. After about 30 minutes, we get the girls in and we start walking through the gym. That's when something fell. Then another thing fell. I thought the roof was falling apart until I saw something arching in the dark. If it's falling from the roof, it should fall straight down. It shouldn't look like it was being thrown from 10 feet away from me. But you could see the stuff flying horizontal if you caught it with your light. This went on for about 20 minutes before it stopped. At this point, me and my friends are pretty freaked out, but nobody wants to come and say what we're all thinking. So I moved to the classroom down the hall. As soon as we stepped in, me and one of the girls saw a piece of wood go flying from a desk. It went from sitting still to moving at an incredible speed on its own. It still blows my fucking mind, and I still don't know exactly what it was. We could see stuff flying down the hall like someone was throwing it, but we couldn't hear any footsteps. There was no way anybody could make it through that school without making the floor beneath you squeak and pop. At some point, I started to interact with it. I started throwing trash and debris down the hall from the classroom door, and those objects would be thrown back. This went on for about an hour and a half before it finally stopped. The last thing it threw, it was like an MLB pitcher used all of its strength and just threw whatever it had. And that was that. I started looking at different religions the next day and eventually settled for Christianity. That school forever changed my life and my idea of the afterlife. I'm not superstitious. I don't think demons and angels are responsible like a religious fruitcake. However, I do believe in a higher power now, that's for sure. My first prayer to St. Anthony. Once upon a time, there was a family that consisted of several members, among whom was a person known as Dee Dee, who was an unfortunate victim of having their phone stolen by a supposed acquaintance who went by the name of Y. Despite being confronted by the other friend who had spotted the phone in Y's possession, Y vehemently denied any wrongdoing, leaving the family with no choice but to involve the police in the matter. Fortunately, even with the presence of an eyewitness, Dee was still unable to retrieve their phone, causing the family to feel a sense of despair, believing that Y may have disappeared and the device to eliminate any potential evidence against them. Feeling hopeless, the family returned home, and it was at this point that Dee's faith and spirituality were put to the test. In a desperate attempt to recover the stolen phone, Dee turned to prayer, specifically to St. Anthony, whom they had never prayed to before. They prayed that the phone would be returned to them in its entirety, with no information or data deleted or tampered with. For the next 3 days, the family awaited a response, unsure of what to expect. However, to great surprise, Y showed up at their doorstep returning the phone with a flimsy excuse, claiming that a group of kids had found it in a bush and handed it to them. The family was naturally skeptical of Y's explanation, but to their relief, the phone was returned to them entirely intact, per Dee's prayer. It felt like a true miracle to Dee, who couldn't believe that their prayers had been answered. In summary, what started as a distressing incident for Dee and their family ended up being a testament to the power of faith and prayer. Despite the odds being against them, they managed to recover the stolen phone with the help of a higher power. It's a story that highlights the importance of never giving up hope, and the belief that sometimes, even in the midst of the most dire circumstances, miracles can happen. Strange smells and sounds. Just to have some context on the area we live in, my family, we live in a mobile home park where the trailers have been converted to homes. So recently, me and my wife and the rest of the family that lives with us have been hearing or smelling strange sounds. At first, we thought it was a stray cat or raccoons, but then things started getting weirder. We started hearing sounds. Sometimes it would be footsteps. Other times we would hear knocking. We thought maybe we smoked a bit too much of the devil's lettuce, but everyone else in the house was also hearing these things. That's when the sounds started, and people were talking to us now. But the weird thing was, it always sounds like they're incredibly far away. The most recent thing was the smell of a rotten corpse of some kind, but I couldn't for the life of me remember the last time I smelled a corpse like that. The smell seemed the most intense as it was right in front of me. I checked around our house and under it to make sure there were no dead animals. This happened at almost 12 at night when my wife and I were outside smoking. I had my brother come out and check, and even he agreed that it wasn't just me who smelled it, and he said it smells like a corpse of a person. That's when I remembered why the smell seemed so familiar, because a man had died a few years ago, and I remembered how many times we walked by his corpse. They realized he died inside the wall, but I never forgot the smell. It was very horrid. Still, the smell only happened about once, and it hasn't come back that I know of. I'm usually one to think of scientific reasons. I ended up checking if possible sewage had leaked from a pipe or if it came from our neighbor's house, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. These weird happenings only seem to happen at night, and most of the people who live near us are usually asleep by 10 p.m., and we stay up till about 12 or 1 in the morning. My neighbors have told me that on a few occasions, they've been outside at that hour, saying that they feel uncomfortable or that they hear something, but they chalk it up to maybe random animals or them being tired. Apparition in voices witnessed by friends and I, as well as my parents, shared experiences. There's only one place I've ever been at that I believe was haunted, and it was my family's house in the mountains, which I won't disclose the location of. It was a nice 3-story house with lots of places to sleep, and my friends and I had a lot of good memories there. My craziest experience was when I was playing Ghosts in the Graveyard, which is basically like a game of hide and seek, but with tag. Ghosts weren't really on my mind at all, and just messing around, I remember standing next to my friend who owned the house, and we were looking down the bottom floor stairs, and for some reason, it was night and I noticed that the room below was eerily dark. I shouted, "Ghost in the graveyard, come get us," as a joke, just friendly teasing my paranoid friend, and suddenly a veil of darkness rushed up the stairs and flew right into my face. My friend and I screamed and ran into the living room. When our friends came over, my friend explains exactly what I saw. He saw the darkness of the room deepen, and then he saw a black figure fly up the stairs into my face. I didn't feel anything when it happened. My other major experience, there was hearing voices. The craziest time was when me and my friends were hanging out in the living room, just having a normal conversation, when we heard talking and footsteps upstairs. We assumed our friend's brother was home because that's where his bedroom was and thought nothing of it. It wasn't until like an hour later that my friend realized his brother wasn't home at all, and yet we were still literally talking to him, like a few brief conversations upstairs and walking around, and we were all totally thinking that he was home, when it was only us in the living room. My friends have also reported alongside my brother, who visited only a couple times, observing the stove turn on by itself, with a knob set to heat. They also would hear the sound of marbles or something else similar, small objects dropping in the kitchen. When I was a baby, apparently I grew up in a haunted house as well. My parents said for years that they both saw shadows of children running around the yard, but they hadn't acknowledged it to each other for a very long time, and yet they both saw them. What's crazy about my dad's story, I think it's one of the craziest ghost stories I've ever heard. He was driving home late at night, and suddenly, as if being pulled in the driveway itself, his car heavily bumped over something, and he was convinced he ran over either a person or an animal. He got out to investigate and saw nobody. He gets back in the car and says after sitting down, a girl suddenly appeared from a tube of smoke that traveled from the hood of the car to the side window. He said she wore clothing like you'd imagine a farmer's daughter wearing in early America, overalls and just long dark hair, and she was young. She said she was in a gray scale or black and white. He said he didn't feel afraid looking at her. She just stared at him through the window for a moment before vanishing. I'll also just add I'm no bullshitter, and neither are my dad's or friends. These were isolated events in our lives, heavily tied to specific locations. My friend's house was either near an Indian burial site, or there used to be Indians on that land, I forgot which. My parents' old house was an old-ass house too. I hate that people make up stories in places where real experiences are meant to be shared. These were real experiences, but I don't know the reality of what they really were. But these are the ones that can't be explained by us rationally. Dark figure that used to watch me sleep when I was 8. I saw a ghost when I was younger, and I want some answers as to what happened. I'll try to give as much detail as possible. 15 years ago when I was 8 years old, I had this dark figure stand in my doorway. But it wouldn't stand directly in the doorway, but more on the side, leaning into the doorway, as to sort of hide. I think it was hiding because when I went to look at it directly, it would remove its hand from grabbing the door frame, and it would hide back against the wall. But when I looked away, it would grab the door frame again and lean back into my doorway, just standing and watching. For 2 or 3 months, I would sleep under my covers. I wouldn't dare shut my door at night because I didn't want to risk being stuck in my bedroom with the dark figure. One night I got fed up and I got out of bed and charged the dark figure. Now I saw this whole frame head to toe as he was running backwards away from me. But when I caught up to him at the end of the hall, I punched him straight through his chest and he vanished. He didn't disappear for good though. I started seeing him during the day, and only during the day now. And one day I was sitting in my bedroom with my mom when the dark figure appeared standing beside my dresser. My mom didn't see it, but I did. To prove its existence to my mom, I asked it, "Mr. Ghost, can you make the rain stop?" And the rain stopped immediately. Not in a few seconds, but the moment I asked the ghost that question, and then I never saw it again, ever. I just want some answers as to what that whole thing was. The hallway ghost and the shadow. Let me set the stage for you. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind of night that sets the stage for a horror story. This all happened a year ago, when I was living in a house that I suspect was haunted. I didn't have any concrete evidence until that fateful morning when I was in the bathroom taking a piss. I had forgotten to close the door, and that's when it happened. Suddenly I heard a strange groaning noise and turned to see an old-looking ghost pass by. He was balding at the top of his head and had a nightgown on. But what chilled me to the bone was the fact that he was floating. He moved by me so quickly I wasn't sure if I was seeing things. After that encounter, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off in my house. It wasn't until a month or so later that I experienced another haunting, and my fears were confirmed. It was in the dead of night that I was woken up, and I saw a shadowy figure hunched over walking out of my bedroom. The outline of his body appeared to be wearing an old devil costume, something you'd probably see in the 50s. It had a horned plastic mask and a poncho, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. I felt frozen with fear, not sure of what to do next. The presence of these entities in my home confirmed my deepest fears that my house was indeed haunted. It felt like a constant source of dread and unease, not knowing when or where the next sighting would occur. I knew I had to get out of there, but part of me was scared that whatever was haunting me would follow me into my next home. To this day, I still can't shake the feeling of those two encounters. The fear and horror that I experienced still haunts me. I'll never forget the terror of seeing those apparitions, and I know that the supernatural is real, and it's lurking in the shadows, waiting to reveal itself to those brave enough to confront it. Mimics and general weirdness in my new apartment. Moving into a new apartment can be exciting, but also a bit unnerving. For me, the initial weirdness I experienced, I thought it was just my paranoia getting the best of me. But then it started to become more than that. I've been hearing strange things when I'm alone in the bathroom, and at first it was just a faint sound that I couldn't identify. But then I heard my boyfriend's voice clearly speaking to me, even when he wasn't home. The voice was so real that I even answered it a few times before realizing he wasn't actually there. Another time I heard my dog's distinct whine, which was odd because he wasn't even in the apartment at the time. He's a cranky old dog with a very theatrical way of making sounds. It was hard to mistake his whine for anything else, and it happened twice, which made it even more suspicious. But things really started to get strange when I noticed our magnetic spice shelves on the fridge slowly tilting forward off the fridge. I thought it was a fluke, but it happened again. Even though all that was on the shelf were the 2 spice jars and some honey, these shelves can withstand much higher weights, so I knew something was off. I checked to make sure that the magnet was secured, but when I realized it was, I got spooked and busied myself with other things. Then, another bizarre incident occurred. I went to fill the bathtub up to soak a delicate scarf, but I knew the water would take maybe a second or two to warm up, so after turning on the tub, I left the room to grab my phone. But when I returned, I found that the water had been switched to the shower setting rather than the faucet. It takes some strength to switch it like that, so I knew it wasn't just a simple mistake. I got so freaked out that I ran into the living room and couldn't move until my boyfriend got home. I started researching things about our town to see if anything like this had happened before, and I found an episode of Dead Files that was filmed in our town. Oddly enough, the beginning of the episode took place at a local crystal shop that I frequent. The episode went into how a male spirit will mess with people in the bathroom and follow them home. After watching the episode, I couldn't help but feel that strange occurrences in my apartment were not just my imagination. I've since been on edge whenever I'm in the apartment alone, and I always feel like I'm being watched. It's a feeling that's hard to shake, and I'm not sure what to do next. When I was a kid, my friend and I went on an adventure near a big factory in our city that was surrounded by tons and tons of trees that weren't cared for. My friend wanted to go on the tree grounds to look for lizards and cicadas, and I followed him around. We shuffled through trees and bushes, and after a while, he said he noticed something inside a gap in a tree, so he picked up a stick to poke at the gap. I was on the other side of the tree, and suddenly I heard him yell, "Super huge spider!" I turned around to face the tree, and there came this massive, quick-as-hell, green-brownish-looking spider, the size and morphology just like a facehugger from the Alien movies, crawled in a spiral downwards motion down the tree. Having never witnessed anything like that in my whole life, I yelped like a little bitch at the sight of this thing, and it took off running as fast as I could, my friend right behind me. After a few seconds, he said, "Wait, let's go back and get a good look at it." But there was no way in hell I'd go back anywhere near that thing. However, after much convincing, I agreed to go back, but only if we stayed the hell away and a good distance. So we found our way back to that tree, and that cursed thing was still hanging around there, staying unmoving, not even micro movements. We tried to get the best look at it as we could while trying to stay at a safe distance. I remember that it had long legs just like a facehugger, just minus the tail. And one strange thing about it was its body itself. My friend got a longer stick to poke at the thing and made it move a bit more before it moved around the other side of the tree, where we couldn't see it anymore. We would have to get closer to the tree in order to get it to go to the other side of it, and frankly, at that point, we were both too freaked out to do that, so we just booked it out of there. Later on, we told other friends about it, and no one believed us. It was just too unreal for them to fathom that a spider that huge existed. Even I found it hard to believe that I saw such a creature. But the incident stayed with me for a long time, and every time I went near that factory, my mind would wander to that spider, and I would start feeling uneasy. The experience was a lesson for me to be careful while exploring unknown areas, because you never know what you might come across. As an individual who's always tried to find a logical explanation for everything, I've never really believed in the paranormal, but my new house has had some events that are hard to explain, making me question my beliefs. It all started when my family and I moved into our nearby brand new house last summer in July. The house is only 3 years old, and the previous family lived in it for 2 years. Coincidentally, we lived across the street from a fairly large cemetery, which may or may not have something to do with the incidences that we've been experiencing. The cemetery is quite new and doesn't really give off any creepy vibes, but it's hard to ignore its proximity to our home. The first incident occurred about 2 weeks after we moved in. I was sitting in the living room on the couch, reading The Mist, while enjoying our new fireplace. My sister was in the basement and my parents had gone out grocery shopping. Suddenly I heard what sounded like a car pulling into our driveway, and the garage door open. My dog, who always comes to the door to greet my parents when they get home, came running out of the bedroom and looked out the front window. I expected them to come in the back door any second, but I heard nothing. My dog kept running back and forth from the front window to the front door, and I finally got up to go see what was taking them so long. But there was no one in the driveway. I figured maybe they were already in the garage, so I went and opened the garage door, but the garage was empty. At this point, I was a little bit freaked out, but I decided I wasn't used to the house and the noises it makes. My parents got home about 15 minutes later, though, and I mentioned it to my sister. She told me that when she was upstairs in the kitchen, it sounded like someone had come into the garage, yet no one was there again. The next story involves my mom. This happened probably a month or so ago, after we moved in. It was the middle of the day in the summer, and I was sitting in my room studying for my summer course finals. My mom was in the kitchen doing dishes. She called to me from the kitchen and asked if I heard anything. I told her no. I was just sitting in the room quietly. She then told me that while she was doing the dishes, she heard a loud male voice, basically right in her ear, yell, "What are you doing?" It was so loud that she assumed I must have heard it too. Our house has very high ceilings, and everything echoes, so you can hear noises from across the house. I didn't hear a thing. That story still freaks the both of us out because either the house is haunted or my mom is losing her mind. The next story, and probably the last one I'm going to mention, because this post is already getting too long, is one that involves me and has been happening since before Christmas now. I live in a small bedroom on the upper floor of a house. All of the bedrooms have carpet that make a very distinct sound when you walk across them. I usually sleep with earplugs in because we have a toddler living in the house, and I enjoy my sleep, but occasionally, when she's away for the evening at my sister's boyfriend's house, I'll only sleep with one earplug in and lay on my other ear, so I have freedom to hear when I like. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. It was around 4:30 in the morning, and someone seemed to be walking across the carpet in my room. I immediately sat up, assuming it was my cat, but when I turned to my phone flashlight, there was nothing there. I felt a little scared because the footsteps sounded too human-like, and my cat couldn't have walked in and out of the room that fast. After a few minutes, my cat walked down the hallway and into my room. It was on the other side of the house, which made me even more confused. I tried to convince myself that it was just my earplug rubbing up against my pillow, making a sound familiar to the sound of my carpet, but the noises continued every few weeks or so, for a couple of nights in a row. I even heard the same sound with both earplugs in, which made me even more concerned. I thought maybe I was going insane or developing schizophrenia. I only talked about this to my mom because she believes in the paranormal stuff. Then she told that to my sister, who lived in the basement bedroom with her boyfriend. And they had been hearing similar noises at night. They described it as someone crawling across their floor. The incidents continued to occur, and my sister and I were both worried about it. And one night, I heard that what sounded like multiple footsteps running around in my room. I didn't sleep for a couple nights after that, but lately I've been sleeping with both earplugs in, and I haven't heard anything for the last month now. Disappearing person in a raincoat. When I was around 5 years old, I was at my grandparents' house. It was a gloomy morning, and my grandfather and I were chatting in the dining room. Suddenly, I saw a person walking by the window. They were moving at a fast pace, wearing only a yellow raincoat, and their head was down. They were heading towards the door, which was to my right, and anyone going in that direction would have seen him. As they walked by, I had a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. I asked my grandfather to check who was at the door, because I thought it might be my aunt who had come home from work. My grandfather ran to the door to check, but no one was there. I was confused because the distance between the window and the door was only a few feet away, and you would have had to see the person walking, unless they ran at a very high speed. Moreover, if they kept moving forward, they would have hit a fence. This incident left me feeling scared and bewildered, and I couldn't explain what I had seen. My father suggested that it might be a time traveler passing through our time, but I didn't know what to make of it. This was my first paranormal experience, and it stayed with me for a long time. As I grew older, I started researching paranormal phenomena, different theories that could explain what I saw. I came across different explanations, including the possibility of a ghost, an alien, or even a glitch in the Matrix, and none of them seemed to fit perfectly, and I still couldn't explain what had happened that morning. Over time, I learned to accept that some things must remain unexplained, and that's okay. This experience taught me to keep an open mind and not to dismiss things that I can't explain. Who knows? Maybe one day I'll get an answer to what I saw that gloomy morning in my grandparents' house. Both my parents had a dream about my little sister that came true. Let me tell you a story about my sister, Mika. When she was around 5 or 6 years old, my parents had a dream about her. Now, it's important to note that my parents are not superstitious people, but this dream was so vivid and realistic that they took it very seriously. We were supposed to go to my step-grandmother's house for the day and fix something on the roof, but my parents told Mika to stay away from anything high, because they had both dreamt that she fell from a high place. They were so worried about her safety that they asked me to watch her closely that day. I made sure to keep her away from ladders or anything where she could fall from a high place. And the day passed without any incident. But a week or two later, something happened that made us all wonder if the dream was a premonition. Mika fell in the basement right beside the stairs. The basement was unfinished, which meant the floor was cement, and she landed head first on it. My parents and I rushed over to her, fearing the worst, but to our surprise, she was completely fine, a little shooken up, but otherwise unharmed. My parents took her to the doctor to ensure that there were no serious injuries, and by some miracle, there wasn't any sign of a concussion or anything else. I can't explain how grateful I am that she walked away from that fully unscathed. It's like someone was watching out for her that day. She's now 18 and living her best life, but the memory of that day still haunts me. What's interesting is that my parents never had a dream like that again. They're not sure if it was a premonition or just a coincidence, but it's something that stuck with all of us all these years. It's a reminder that sometimes there are things beyond our understanding that maybe, just maybe, there's something out there looking out for us. Ask Reddit 3. When I was just 10 years old, I had an experience that I'll never forget. It was a Sunday morning, and my mother was in the kitchen preparing lunch. As she watched the vegetables, the water pressure from the tap started to fluctuate, going from flowing to stopping, and then repeating the process. My mom called out, asking who was messing with the water pressure. My dad went outside to inspect the valve for the water tank, and I followed him. But we found nothing was out of place, and as we walked back into the house, we witnessed something truly bizarre. Bloody chicken claw prints began to appear on the floor, one by one, as if a chicken with bloodied feet had walked through the hall. The prints just kept coming, one after another, until there were about 5 or 6 total. Everyone in my family saw it, and we were all stunned. We didn't discuss it immediately, and my parents just wiped the claw prints off the floor. What made this event even worse was the fact that it happened during a very turbulent period in my household. My mom had schizophrenia, but at that point, she wasn't diagnosed yet. She heard hostile voices in her head and was convinced that there was a grand conspiracy against her. She thought that people were planning to kidnap me and my sister, and she didn't trust my father, her mother, or her siblings. So when something legitimately paranormal happened, it just messed everything up even more. In a world where bloody chicken prints appear, why wouldn't there be some occult conspiracy? Those few months were the most traumatic of my childhood. My mom was admitted into a psychiatric facility a few weeks later after being diagnosed with schizophrenia. Dealing with her paranoia and violent outbursts against everyone not her children broke my world. Part of me even believed her. Having some legit paranormal shit happening in the middle of the day didn't help at all. Now, at 17 years later, my mother is still on medication, but she's stable and fully functional. Even when she was going through the worst of her schizophrenic episodes, she was never neglectful. She was always loving towards her children, always dutiful. However, she was overprotective during those times. I've always been afraid that I'd get schizophrenia too, as it's somewhat hereditary. My mom's sister became quite unstable a couple of years ago, and to complete the double jeopardy of this insanity, my dad's sister also has paranoia, and her son was admitted for a manic episode. The propensity for psychotic disorders on both sides of my family tree has made me pretty resolute on not getting married and having kids. I don't want to pass on this genetic disposition to my offspring. It's a difficult decision, but one that I feel is necessary to ensure the cycle of mental illness ends with me. Ask Reddit 4. In 2017, my life was completely turned upside down when I lost my fiancé to organ failure. The pain and grief that followed were unbelievable, and I found myself spiraling into a deep state of depression. It seemed like there was going to be no hope for me to recover from such a devastating loss. But as time passed, I slowly started to make progress. I sought help from therapists and support groups, and I began to take small steps towards healing. One of those steps was attending a convention in Novi, Michigan in April of 2018. I met up with a friend and we decided to grab some drinks at a bar. We chatted about upcoming conventions and reminisced about previous events. After a few Long Island iced teas, I was feeling pretty buzzed. That's when my friend suggested we check out the beer sampling session that the convention was hosting. We got to try 5 different beers, one from each vendor, and then rank them from best to worst. I was already a bit drunk from the hard liquor, but I thought it was a great idea to keep drinking beer. Before I knew it, I downed 40 ounces of the stuff and I was completely smashed. As the night went on, we joined a group of people who were playing cards. Suddenly someone showed up with a bottle of Mountain Dew that had something other than Mountain Dew in it. I don't remember much after that point, but my friend tells me that I drank about 8 more ounces of the mysterious liquid. The next thing I knew, I was blacked out. I have no memory of what happened next, but apparently I was brought back up to my hotel room and left alone. When my roommate arrived, he found me face down on the bathroom floor, passed out, with an empty pill bottle of Benadryl in my room. He immediately called 911 and I was rushed to the hospital. What happened next is something that I'll never forget. Between the time that I passed out and woke up, I had the most vivid dream of my life. I was in an open room surrounded by people I didn't even know, except for one, my fiancée. I hugged her for what felt like an hour, but it could have been only seconds. All I remember was telling her how much I loved her before a bright light shined on my face and I slowly woke up. According to the doctors and EMT who treated me, I had to be revived because my heart had flatlined. It's scary to think about it, but it's entirely possible that I may have died and it was my first vision past where I am now. I'm grateful to the doctors who saved my life and my friend for calling 911 as soon as he saw me. Losing my fiancé was the hardest thing I've ever gone through, but this experience has shown me that I need to take care of myself and make better choices. Life is precious. I don't want to waste it by putting myself in dangerous situations. I know that I still have a long road ahead of me, but I'm determined to keep fighting and to honor my fiancé's memory by living my life to the fullest. Brief experience that went away as a neighbor got better. I used to live in a cozy little apartment complex with 3 units. My place was situated on the 2nd floor, with a neighbor on the other side and one below. I'd never experienced anything out of the ordinary in this place. That was until my next-door neighbor started having a really bad mental episode. It was no secret that she struggled with depression and possibly BPD, but things started to escalate quickly. Eventually, the police had to kick her door down for a wellness check, and that was just the beginning of my own strange encounters. It was a regular evening, and I was making dinner with some friends. We were all sitting on the couch when I decided to lay my ear down against a cushion. Suddenly, I heard what sounded like breathing coming from the cushion itself. I quickly got up to investigate, and that's when my friend told me that she had felt like something was watching her all night. The experience was unnerving, to say the least. As time passed, the situation with my neighbor got worse, and I started feeling more and more creeped out. One evening while I was heading to my bedroom, I decided to speak out loud to whatever was there. I said, "If there's anything here, you can make yourself known, but please don't break anything." Later that same night, while I was in bed, I heard a giant thud against my wall. My heart was racing and I quickly shot up to investigate. It wasn't my roommate, and there was nothing that I could see. The experience left me shaken, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. The strange events persisted for a while, but they finally ceased when my neighbor was involuntarily committed for a while. She came back seeming normal and happy, and I haven't had any further issues since then. Looking back on it all, I think her negative and vulnerable mental state might have somehow invited bad energy or something. It's hard to say for sure. I don't know if anyone else has had similar brief hauntings, I guess we'll call them. But I wanted to share this and let others know that they are not alone. Mysteries of the Hanriskaya Hospital. I've heard many stories about an abandoned hospital in Moscow that was infamous for its dark past. It was built during the 1970s after the authorities approved the construction of a modernized medical facility. However, the site was the city's northern district, which was once a graveyard. Despite the skepticism surrounding the project, the planners remained undeterred and went ahead with the construction of the 10-story building, designed with harsh brutalist architecture and a capacity to hold up to 1,300 patients. In the summer of 1980, construction of the project finally commenced, and people in the vicinity watched as the concrete behemoth gradually began to rise from the ground. After 2 years, the building's outer shell was complete, but work came to a halt when the funds set aside for the construction work were exhausted. It was then discovered that the site was a wetland, resulting in the basement levels of the building being continually flooded, causing the project to go bankrupt. With no security, the abandoned hospital soon became a magnet for murderers, drug dealers, drug addicts, cultists, homeless people, and those looking for adventure. As time passed, the building's partially completed internal structures began to degrade, and people who ventured inside suffered misfortune. The remains of those who died while sheltering from the elements of the site were discovered by others who were trespassing there. Furthermore, the bodies of murder victims were also found within the grounds of the derelict buildings, leading to concerns of possible serial killings. One such victim was a reverend local pensioner who died in 1985 after her dog ran off while she was walking in the vicinity of an abandoned site. After summoning up the courage to follow the dog, she made her way into the reception area of the building before recoiling in disgust. The area was literally riddled with rotting bodies and bones of several other dogs and smaller animals. Sometime later, a group of boys who had decided to explore the basement levels of the building discovered the old lady's body floating in a large crater of water, with horrific injuries to her back and lower torso, and both of her legs had been broken and shattered. Another incident occurred in 2005 when a popular boy, Alexei Kryashkonikin, who was known amongst his friends as Edge, went missing. After a search, his personal belongings were found on the 8th floor, and his body was later discovered lying in a side room on the hospital's 2nd floor. Like the previous elderly victim, he had suffered catastrophic injuries after a severe fall, but his body had been located in a small enclosed room, leaving the situation unexplainable. Many other stories have circulated throughout the local community, such as 3 teens who were found slain at the same site at some point during 2006. There's also the tale of an urban explorer whose body was discovered at the bottom of one of those empty lift shafts, brutally twisted and broken. Unfortunately, the exact number of hospital's victims remains difficult to verify, as the city authorities have reportedly refused to release any official figures. Despite the darkness that surrounds the abandoned hospital, there's surprisingly one bright story. Local tales tell of a friendly spirit by the name of Raph, who inhabits the building and acts as the keeper of the abandoned hospital. Raph allegedly helps lost people find the exit and rescues trapped people, such as those whose legs are stuck between concrete blocks or have fallen into an elevator shaft. Nobody knows for sure if the deaths which occurred there were the results of supernatural activities or the grim deeds of a human killer, but everybody seems to have an opinion on it. Some blame the cultists, while others believe that the deaths were the work of serial killers who may have been using the abandoned building as a place to commit their crimes, or as somewhere to display their grisly trophies. There are also those that speculate that the deaths have been the result of the supernatural. For them, the fact that the land which was repurposed for the construction was a former cemetery is perhaps a true cause of the horrors. They believe that the spirits of the dead rose from their graves, electing to punish the living who were trespassing into their domain. Whatever the true cause of the deaths, it is clear that the abandoned hospital was a place of great tragedy and horror. The stories of death and misery associated with the building have created a reputation for it's one of the scariest places on the planet. Despite the dangers, people continued to make pilgrimage to the site, hoping to catch a glimpse of the supernatural, or to satisfy their curiosity about the dark history of the building. After many years of reported tragedy, the abandoned facility was finally sold off to a private company in 2018. The sale brought an end to the long and tragic history of the building, and it seemed as though the dark secrets of the hospital's past would finally be laid to rest. In October of that year, the building's superstructure was eventually demolished before being completely cleared away, removing all traces of the hospital and its sinister past once and for all. As for the stories of the supernatural and occultists, they live on in the memories of those who knew the hospital during its time of abandonment. Some even claim that the spirit of a friendly entity named Raph still inhabits the site, acting as a keeper to the abandoned hospital and helping lost and trapped people find their way out. Regardless of whether or not these stories are true, the legend of the abandoned hospital will continue to captivate the imaginations of those who seek out stories of horror and the unknown. Heard my dead cat last night. 4 years ago, I had a cat that passed away. He was a special cat because he had this strange habit of going out into the living room in the middle of the night and just screaming, "Hello," repeatedly. The most fascinating thing about it was that he sounded like a person, not a cat. Whenever I had guests over, I'd have him warn them about his behavior because it would scare the living daylights out of them. Last night, I heard the same "hello" sound coming from the living room again, and it took me a moment to fully wake up and realize that it was impossible for me to hear it again. It was as if my mind was still trying to come to terms with what my ears were hearing. I sat up in bed and kept hearing the sound, so I knew I had to check it out. I got out of bed and ran into the living room. However, as soon as I got there, the sound stopped. I looked around the room, but there was no sign of any living creature making the noise. My other cats were all sound asleep, and they had never made that noise before, so I knew it couldn't have been them. At this point, I had no idea what to make of it. Some of my friends suggested that maybe it was just a dream, but I knew that it wasn't. I had been fully awake when I heard the noise, and it had been loud and clear. I couldn't ignore the fact that I had heard the same sound that my old cat used to make. It's hard to say what happened that night, but I can't shake off the feeling that maybe it was my old cat trying to say hello to me one more time. It's been 4 years since he passed, but I still miss him dearly. If it really was him, I'm glad he stopped by to say hello. Weirdest experience in my home yet. I'm in my early 40s, and I've never had any paranormal experiences before moving into my house 4 years ago. Since then, I've had a lot of strange things happen while living here. It's like I'm constantly living in a haunted house. I've tried to brush it off as just coincidences, but there's too many things happening for it to be a coincidence. I've had a lot of lights turning off and on, sinks turning on by themselves full blast, the vacuum turn on by itself, items disappearing and reappearing, paintings starting to swing on the walls, music randomly playing from all the speakers in my home as examples. I can't explain any of it. Even the HVAC guy who recently worked on my furnace asked if my house was haunted because he witnessed things turning on and moving on their own. Earlier today, I was in my bedroom getting ready for work when I dropped an earring on the floor. I watched it as it dropped and hit the floor, and I saw it on the floor. I bent down to pick it up and it disappeared. Like it was there 1 second and gone the next. I looked all around for it, and I got a flashlight, moved furniture sort of nearby, and looked underneath. I even got a broom and swept the area trying to find it, but it was gone. It literally disappeared into thin air, right in front of me. I felt like I was going crazy. I left the house and went on a long walk to clear my head. When I came back, I continued to look for the missing earring. I searched every inch of my bedroom and bathroom, but I still couldn't find it. I couldn't believe what was happening. I then said out loud, "Very funny. You made your point. Just let me find it before I go crazy." I was desperate to find it. I then had an urge to look in a specific place, and I found it. But here's the thing. There's no plausible way it could have gotten to where I found it from, where I dropped it. It was like it was placed there on purpose, just to mess with me. For the record, I do live alone and no one else was in my house today. I've never been so scared in my life. It's like the house was having a life of its own, and it's not a friendly one. I've been considering moving out of this house for a long time, but I don't know where to go or what I'll do. I'm starting to think that this house is cursed, and I'm trapped here forever. How did the grape move? So a little background before I get into detail about what happened. I'm a very science-based person. If something happens that confuses me or someone else, I do my best to use science to explain that phenomenon, and it hasn't failed me yet, other than questions about physics that just haven't been answered yet, and the best you can do is form a theory. So last night, I couldn't use science to figure out how an item moved across the way it did. I reached a block, and I have no other explanation other than it was either a glitch in the Matrix, as some like to say, or a spirit. With that in mind, I hope you read this or hear this with an open mind. Last night, my roommate and I were in the kitchen of our house. Housing is on my college campus. And I was eating grapes, and I had this amazing idea to try and make a raisin out of it. And I put it on top of the box at the center of our kitchen table. Yeah, I'm aware that it wouldn't turn into a grape that way. It was just because it seemed too stupid. Anyway, I was continuing to cut up food for my dinner, and my roommate was sitting in one of the chairs nobody else was in the house, and no music was playing, and out of the corner of my eye, the grape just pretty much moved close to the edge of the table and didn't roll off. The grape didn't slightly roll off the box and then continue to roll to the edge. No, it had a little bit of air, and once it hit the table, it was still and didn't continue to roll. It was as if someone had walked by and was like, I'm going to move this grape, because why not? Usually, if something like that were to happen, the noise would be made by someone hitting the table, which would mean that because someone hit the table, the grape would move. But that's the thing, nobody hit the table. Another thing to mention is that it wasn't just me who was confused. When I saw the grape move, I was silent for 5 to 7 seconds, and then I looked at my roommate to see if they saw anything, or if I was just crazy, and that's a thing. He was already looking at me to figure out if I had seen what he saw. At this point, we have a grape moving on its own, getting a little bit of air, and it was moving through the air pretty fast. Fast enough to the point that I had been almost flicked from behind or picked it up with a hand and then placed it back down. Nobody had moved or hit the table because it was just me and my roommate, and there was no sound of something hitting the table. So now my roommate and I are being scientific people. We decide not to take the pictures of where the grapes was, not only to take the pictures of where the grapes were, but where it had landed, and we tried to recreate the experiment. After making a border of where the grape exactly landed, we decided to put the grape back on the box and bump into the table as if someone were to hit the table, just in case we actually did hit it and just didn't realize. What we found was that no matter how hard we were to bump or hit the table, the grape either would just wobble on the box, or if it did manage to roll, it would only slowly roll off the box and wouldn't go far at all. We tried blowing on the graph to see if maybe the air conditioner would have done something, but didn't think so because we were trying to rule every possible scenario out. After countless efforts, we reached the conclusion that we had no idea what had moved it, and we began to bring a little spirituality into the mix. Once everything was ruled out, either because the grape was moving too fast, it was in the air for too long, or somehow had a little bit of airtime, we decided to try to act like a spirit. As one person sat in the chair, the other walked by and moved the grape similarly to how it looked to us. We found that this was the only scenario that allowed the grape to move the way that it did. My roommate and I were pretty convinced that the only explanation that we have is that it was some sort of spirit. As much as I'd like to grab onto that concept, I tried to bring a little more science into the mix by thinking about separate timelines crossing where my roommate did, and in fact moved the grape. And somehow our timelines crossed, and so on, but that scenario has some problems and whatnot, and they're a little confusing. A cool idea I had, but maybe it was the future us, and we somehow were able to travel back in time and move the grape almost like what happened in Interstellar, when they thought that they were communicating with aliens, but it was actually them the entire time. Sorry for the spoiler. Traveling back in time, as some know, has a lot of multiverse theory. Then it gets a little bit more promising, but again, there's more problems that come with that, and I was thinking that it was a spirit. While one is more scientific, the other seems more reasonable. By now, I hope you have a pretty good understanding of what happened, and I hope some people would give their input and ideas as to what happened, because nobody can be right or wrong. But some theories may be better than others at explaining this particular phenomenon. I also included some pictures so you can get a better idea of what we're talking about here. What just happened? My grandfather, who I was really close with my entire life, recently passed away in October of 2022. The news was given that he had 1 to 5 years and rapidly declined so fast that he only made it a month. The news was a devastating blow to my family. My grandfather was the wisest and most organized man that I'd ever met. He retired young, raised 3 children with a grandmother, and had 3 grandchildren, including myself. He was always someone I wanted advice from. However, he was also the funniest and most friendly man with the biggest heart. He had his stern side as well, but if he told you to do something, you did it, no questions asked. He just had that way about him. Unfortunately, the last time I saw him was in 2019 before I moved states away, and the last conversation I had with him was over Facebook. I gave him reassurance that his last heart surgery would be a success, and I told him that I loved him. After he passed, I took only a few days of bereavement leave from my job and notified only my boss to explain the situation. Fast forward to now, a couple months later, I've had some time to grieve and accept the finality of the situation, as have the rest of my family. I work in auto finance and customer service and was recently promoted to team leader in August, before he passed. In November, I took over a brand new team of new hires to the company. I spent a month getting to know my new team and the different personalities. One man on my team is an older gentleman who is very religious. I myself can't say I ever considered myself to be religious, but after today's experience, I can't say my opinion remains the same. This morning, I arrived at my office earlier than normal. I'd purchased some gifts for my team, and I wanted to have it set up for them when they all came in, since it was our last day in the office before Christmas. My team arrived, and I proceeded to start my day as normal. As I walked past this particular team member, he asked me if I knew somebody in my life by the name of, my grandfather's name. I was taken back and said, "Yes, I do. Why do you ask?" This team member proceeded to tell me that he saw my grandfather standing by my desk, and he told him that I need to keep my family close and that he was very proud of me. The team member then went on to explain that the man he spoke to came off as stern and asked him to come here, and without hesitation, the team member felt he needed to get up with urgency. He went on to explain that he had angel wings and he was in heaven and looking after me and my family. I sat back and tried to think logically about this experience. How did he know this stuff? Did he stalk my Facebook? No, because not only is my page completely private, but not one post was made about my grandfather on my page or any of my family's. Did I tell anybody at all at work? My grandfather's name? No, I didn't. There's no logical explanation for this team member of mine to make these unusually specific claims. What really struck me was the statement, "Keep your family close." While vague, my grandfather was really the glue that held us together. I'm close with my mother, who now lives in the same state I moved to, but my aunt and uncle and grandmother still live in an old state. My aunt and uncle don't get along. I truly believe that he's worried about the family breaking apart and living separate lives now that he's gone. Obligatory, I don't work in a morgue, but story is relevant. I was on a bachelorette trip in Helen, Georgia, with the bride of some of her friends. I've had bad asthma, and I have this bad issue with breathing before the trip, but I still wanted to go, so I brought my nebulizer machine with me to use. We rented a really beautiful little cabin up in the woods, but the roads were windy, and we got turned around on the way up. The wrong turn accidentally led us to a really old, really small family cemetery. We just turned around and eventually found the place. I had already volunteered to sleep on the couch, and not enough bedrooms, and the couch was comfy. But it was off the kitchen. Not a big deal. One of the first nights we were there, I remember half waking up absolutely struggling to breathe and coughing a lot. A nice-looking younger, quiet guy came over and smiled at me, and helped load my mask with meds before placing it over my face. He then fixed the blanket covering me, turned on the nebulizer, and walked out of view, presumably into the living room. I felt so tired and dozed off again not long after. The next morning, we were all eating breakfast, and I casually asked whose boyfriend had arrived late last night. All the girls just looked at me, bewildered. I explained what had happened, and how when I woke up, the machine was off and the mask was hanging in the arm of the couch. I said I wanted to thank whoever it was. The girls all nervously looked at me and reiterated that none of their partners were there, or even in the state. We ended up leaving for a ziplining excursion, and I had to put it out of my head for a while. When we came back, though, I decided to take a walk through the woods with one of the other girls. Ended up back at the cemetery that we'd found earlier. There were only 7 to 8 grave markers, and most were so worn away that you couldn't see names or dates, except one. It was for a young man about our age. I felt a warm pressure around my shoulders like someone was putting a blanket or a sweater on me. But when I turned, no one was there. The girl who was with me relayed the name on the grave to the others when we got back. We spent the rest of our time there greeting him and saying goodbye to him out loud when we'd come and go. Never saw him again, though. The smell of rose after the funeral. When I was a kid, my school was located near a Muslim cemetery. I never thought much of it until one day when I was passed by and snuck through a gate. A funeral was happening, and I was curious about the Islamic ritual. As I was not my practicing religion, I stayed for a few minutes watching people throwing flowers and paying their respects. Eventually I was asked to leave, and I did so without incident. But as the night fell, I tried to sleep. I was suddenly overwhelmed by the strong scent of roses or maybe jasmine. It was a fragrance that no one in my family had ever used, and I was immediately on edge. I wondered where the scent could be coming from. But eventually my exhaustion overtook me and I drifted off into a troubled sleep. The next week I'd almost forgotten about the strange incident when it happened again. It was Friday night, and after dinner I was in my room trying to sleep when the scent suddenly hit me again. This time I couldn't shake off the unease it caused me, and I felt as though I was being watched. Despite my fear, I didn't tell anyone, not wanting to sound foolish or paranoid. Years passed, and I moved to another country where I lived alone. One day when I was feeling particularly depressed, I was lying in bed in the middle of the night when I smelled the same fragrance again. It was a comfort at first, reminding me of my childhood, but then I realized that I had no explanation for the smell. Over time, the scent kept returning, sometimes stronger than before, and as I lay in bed, the smell of roses or jasmine lingering in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I became convinced that something had followed me from the cemetery, and that it was not a benign spirit. Despite my fear, I never told anyone, and I kept the scent to myself, afraid of being ridiculed or dismissed. Now, as I sit alone in my darkened room, the scent stronger than ever, I can't help but wonder if it's all in my head. But deep down, I know there's something sinister lurking in the shadows, something that wants to harm me, and as the scent grows stronger still, I feel a cold hand wrap around my ankle, pulling me down into the darkness. Creepy things that happened in my old house. Growing up, my family lived in a big Victorian house that was the epitome of horror. The walls were stained with age, and there were strange noises and inexplicable occurrences that never ceased. The wind would whistle eerily through the halls, making it sound like someone was whispering secrets. There were times when I would wind up awake in the middle of the night to see a ghostly apparition of some little girl standing at the end of my bed, her eyes hollow and her hair in disarray. It felt like she was watching me and waiting for something. I would often hear footsteps in the hallway when no one else was home. They would start off as faint tapping sounds, slowly growing louder until it sounded like someone was running towards me. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they would stop, leaving me alone in the darkness, heart racing. But that was just the beginning. One day I returned home from school to find that all the pictures on the walls had fallen down for no reason. The frames were smashed and the glass lay shattered on the floor. My parents dismissed it as a freak accident, but I knew better. I knew that something sinister was lurking in the shadows of that house. And then there was the time that I was home alone and I heard a sound of laughter coming from the basement. It was the sound of a little girl's laughter, and it echoed through the empty house. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just my imagination, but then I heard footsteps coming from the stairs. I froze, unable to move, and then the laughter turned into a blood-curdling scream. Years later, after we moved out, I did some research and found out that there had been several deaths in the house over the years, including a little girl who had died in her sleep. Her name was Emily, and her spirit still haunted the house. I'm convinced that she was the one responsible for all the strange occurrences that had plagued my childhood. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that Emily's ghost is still out there, waiting for someone to join her in the afterlife. If you ever find yourself in an old house with a dark history, be warned. You never know what kind of horror might be waiting for you in the shadows. My paranormal encounter. Is there a plausible explanation? It was a dark and stormy night when I arrived at my friend's house. As I settled into the guest room, I felt a sense of unease wash over me. The room had an eerie atmosphere, as if someone was watching me. I tried to shake off the feeling and went to bed. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to an urgent need to use the restroom. As I turned on the light, I saw a figure move out of the corner of my eye. I froze as I saw a woman standing in the hallway. She was dressed in a white gown, but her face was obscured by long black hair. At first, I thought it was my friend playing a prank on me, but the longer I looked, the more it became real. The woman didn't seem to have any feet, and she was hovering a few inches above the ground. I was terrified and couldn't move or speak. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, but the longer I looked, the more it became real yet again. And as I stood there, the woman slowly turned her head toward me. Her eyes were black and empty, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to wake up my friend, but he was sound asleep. I reached for my phone to take a picture, but it wouldn't work. The woman just stood there, staring at me with those empty eyes. After what felt like an eternity, she started to fade away. As she disappeared, I felt the cold breeze brush against me. It was then that I realized the window in the bathroom was open. Couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. I felt as though something was watching me from the shadows. The next day, I told my friend what had happened, but she didn't believe me. In the days that passed, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. I started seeing the woman in my dreams, and her presence felt more real with each passing night. I began to research the history of the house and discovered that it had a very dark past. There were stories of a woman who died in this house, and her spirit was said to haunt it. I tried to leave the house, but something kept pulling me back. The woman's presence grew stronger, and I could feel her watching me wherever I went. I became paranoid, and my sanity started to slip away. One night, I woke to find the woman standing at the foot of my bed. Her eyes were fixed on me, and I felt as though she was trying to communicate with me. I tried to speak, but no words came out. The woman slowly faded away. but I was left alone in the darkness. The next day, I left the house and never looked back, but the memory of that night still haunts me to this day. I've never been able to explain what happened, but I know that it was real, and I know that the woman's spirit still lingers in that house, waiting for her next victim. This really happened to us. I have a few experiences all on the same land, and down the road from our land. The land used to be part of Mexico and later became Texas. It had a couple of owners, settlers, in the beginning, but the land was eventually parceled out and roads were added. These occurrences were years ago, and one of them, husband and son, believed me immediately because they saw how shaken and excited I was when I came home. They were scared by my fright, and they drove me back to where I'd had my particular experience. But what I saw was gone. All I'm going to say about it was that they were mostly in the trees. There were many of them. They all turned their heads and looked at me, and they were transparent. I was able to put my hand through some of them, but when I walked closer, and at least one followed me partway home, I told my brother and father, and the next day they showed up and asked if I was okay and if I might need to go to the psych hospital. I love them dearly, but I realized that we just had to keep it between me, my husband, and my children. The second incident was hearing a phone ringing in my daughter's room. We heard it at the same time and looked at each other confused. I called the phone company asking why there'd been a phone ringing in my room with no phone. They just told me maybe my old house had a phone bell somewhere and it had been covered over. In the same time frame, we had the front door that the handle would turn right before it reached in to go in. The door didn't open, just the handle turned. It wasn't stuck. That happened to my family several times, and the last two others, who knew nothing about it, and they were caught by surprise. We decided the best thing to do was just ignore it, and finally it stopped. The last episode was just up the drive at my mother-in-law's house, on the same land as our house. We started seeing a man, and it was clearly wasn't my deceased father-in-law. This man was shorter, always in a plaid shirt, jeans, and boots, and seemed to be in his 50s or 60s. He was transparent and shy. I thought I was losing my mind, but then others started seeing him too. My mother-in-law was bedridden from a stroke and had Alzheimer's, and even she saw this figure and would ask who he was. Then 2 different caregivers saw him at different times, and then the caregiver's grandchild. One caregiver became very afraid because she had lost her son in a car accident and was caring for her little grandson while she sat at her mill. Her grandson also reported seeing the man. He also always appeared peripherally and never straight on. None of us recognized him, and we'd all just stand and he'd watch us. We tried speaking to him, we tried approaching him, and he'd vanish. We tried to beckon him to show himself, and finally we decided not to be afraid and just try to ignore it. One caregiver remained frightened for her grandson, but stayed on. This lasted a few years and at different times. After my mill died, everyone left. We never saw him again. Now you may think I made this thing up or we imagined everything, but I'll swear until I die that it all happened. I feel a bit silly for bringing it all up, but I'm a pretty rational adult. However, these experiences stayed with me, and I've wondered how many times, what was it that I was seeing? I never really told anyone outside the ones who saw it for themselves. I can't explain it, can you? My grandpa's ghost saved me. As the days passed, the fear of death had been haunting me, and it became unbearable. Every night I found myself lying awake, consumed by anxiety and the gnawing fear that my consciousness would simply cease to exist, and my physical death would come. The thought of nothingness, of simply disappearing into the void, was too much for me to fear. Despite my efforts to distract myself with books, movies, and anything else that could help me forget about my fear, I remained consumed by it. I even began to consider exploring religion or spirituality, just to find some comfort in the idea of afterlife, but Nothing seemed to work, and the fear only continued to grow. Then one day a forgotten memory came to me like a bolt of lightning. It was a story my great-aunt had told my grandmother many years ago, about how her own father had come to her in her final moments. My great-aunt had been bedridden for many years, unable to walk, and on the night she passed away, she had begged my great-grandmother to help her move to the other side of the bed. When asked why, she replied that her father had been visiting her every night for the past 3 nights, and he had been gently petting her hair as if everything was going to be okay. At the time, my great-aunt had never spoken about ghosts or anything like that, so the story seemed strange and a little unsettling. But now, as I lay in bed, consumed by my fear of death, that memory took on a whole new significance. The thought that our loved ones might be visiting us after they pass away, offering comfort and reassurance, was a powerful one. It gave me a glimmer of hope, and for the first time in months, I found myself drifting off to sleep with a sense of peace. But as the weeks went by, strange things began to happen. I would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that there was someone in my room. I would smell the scent of my great-aunt's favorite perfume, even though I knew it wasn't possible. And sometimes when I was alone in my apartment, I would hear footsteps, or the sound of someone whispering my name. At first I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, but the strange occurrences only became more frequent, and I began to feel like I was losing my grip on reality itself. I started to wonder if I had somehow invited something into my life by dwelling so much on the idea of death and the afterlife. One night as I lay in my bed, the scent of my great-aunt's perfume overwhelming my senses, I saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its presence in the room with me, and it was terrifying. From that point on, I was never able to shake the feeling that something was watching me and following me wherever I went. I tried to tell myself that I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew that something was very wrong. Eventually, I sought help from a spiritual advisor who performed a cleansing ritual to rid me of any negative energy or entities that might be haunting me. The ritual was intense and frightening, but when it was over, I felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. To this day, I'm not sure exactly what was happening to me during those months. Fear and paranoia. But I do know that the memory of my great-aunt's final moments, which had brought me some comfort at first, had somehow invited something dark and terrifying into my life. I learned the hard way that sometimes it's better to leave the mysteries of death and the afterlife alone. The presence in the old hotel, and the staff knew. A few years ago, I had an experience that still haunts me to this day. It was a dark and stormy night, and I found myself alone and stranded in an unfamiliar town. I searched for a place to stay, and my search led me to an old hotel. For the moment I walked in, I knew that something was off. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and it seemed like the building itself was alive with malevolence. The room I was assigned to was small and cozy, with antique furniture, and with 4 big poster beds. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was hard to explain, but I just had the sense that I wasn't alone. The walls seemed to whisper secrets, and the floorboards creaked ominously beneath my feet. As the night wore on, my unease grew. I heard unexplained noises coming from different parts of the room, and it wasn't just the usual creaks and groans of an old building. It was as if someone was walking around, moving furniture and whispering in my ear. The sound of disembodied voices filled the air, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. At one point, I even felt a cold, clammy hand on my shoulder, as if someone had touched me. I turned around, but there was no one there. The feeling of dread intensified, and I knew that I was not alone in that room. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the feeling was too real. I barely slept that night, my eyes wide open and my heart pounding. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, and I felt as if I was trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't awake. When I told the hotel staff about my experience, they didn't seem surprised. In fact, they almost seemed pleased, as if they were eager to share the dark secrets of that haunted place. Apparently, there had been many reports of strange occurrences in that room. Some guests have even claimed to see a ghost figure standing at the foot of their bed, staring at them with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth. It was then that I realized I had not just encountered a ghost. I'd stepped into a realm of darkness and terror, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead were blurred. The hotel was a gateway to a world of horror, and I'd unwittingly walked into its clutches. To this day, I can't forget the horrors that I witnessed in that room. I'm haunted by the knowledge that there are places in this world where evil still lurks, waiting to claim their next victims. If you ever find yourself in an old hotel on a dark and stormy night, beware. You may not be alone like you think you are. My sister wants to make a Ouija board, but I'm not sure it's a good idea. The ominous presence in the house has been growing stronger and more hostile by the day. Every night the air would grow heavy and an unnerving silence would fill the halls. We all felt it, but nobody wanted to talk about it. But my sister, always the bravest of us, wanted to confront the ghost head on. She believed communicating with the spirits was the only way to make it leave, and that's where the Ouija board came in. At first, I was hesitant to even entertain the idea. I'd heard countless horror stories about the dangers of using a Ouija board, how they could invite malevolent spirits into your life, and how they could never truly be disposed of once you started using them. But my sister was determined, and the days passed. Her resolve only grew stronger. Finally, she announced that she was going to make her own Ouija board. She spent hours researching online, reading up on the proper materials and techniques to create a board that would be both effective and safe to use. But as the days turned into weeks, the tension in the house continued to mount. One night while my sister was still in the process of making the board, I woke up to a feeling of intense dread. The air was thick and oppressive, and I could hear a faint whispering in my ear. I sat up, convinced that someone was in the room with me, but there was no one there. It wasn't until the next morning that I realized what had happened. The ghost had infiltrated my dream and was trying to send me a message. Despite the terrifying experience, my sister was undeterred. She finished making the board and waited until the next full moon to try it out. As the clock struck midnight, we all gathered around the board, our fingers trembling with fear and anticipation. My sister called out to the ghost, begging it to make its presence known. At first nothing happened, but then the planchette started moving on its own, spelled out words that none of us had typed. The ghost was communicating with us, and it was angry. It spelled out our names and then started making threats, promising to never leave us alone. We tried to end the session, but the ghost wouldn't let us. It kept spelling out more and more terrifying messages, taunting us with its power and malevolence. And then suddenly the board burst into flames, sending us all scrambling backwards in terror. In the end, we never did manage to get rid of the ghost. If anything, it only grew stronger and more vengeful after our ill-fated attempt at communication. The Ouija board had only served to make things worse, and now we were all trapped in a living nightmare. My paranormal experience in 6th grade, living in an old home. It was the house that no one wanted to live in, but my family couldn't resist the charm of this mid-1800s Victorian home. Little did we know we were moving into a haunted house, a place where terror and fear lurked around every corner. I was only in 6th grade when the first incident happened, a door slamming shut when there was no logical explanation for it. The pet was outside and there was no wind. The house had an eerie feeling, and my mother and I would often hear noises that couldn't be explained. As time went on, things got worse. When home alone, I heard whispers calling out my name. Objects would vanish from one room, only to appear in another. It was as if the ghostly presence was playing a game, tormenting me and my family. My mother would wake up to scratches on her back, but there was no way she could have caused them herself in her sleep. The paranormal activity was terrifying, but it was nothing compared to what I saw. I'll never forget that moment in the kitchen where I saw a white, foggy figure of a little girl with 2 pigtail braids and ribbons at the end of each. She was wearing a frilly dress and was standing in the doorway. I blinked and she was gone. The image was burned into my memory forever. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to use the Ouija board with my friends. The board revealed a 7-year-old girl that had drowned in our clawfoot bathtub, very likely the original fixture in the house. The little girl I had seen was probably the same girl who had died in her home. The thought sent chills down my spine. I wanted to investigate further, but the truth was too frightening. It was possible that there had been a young girl's death in the area, but the authorities might have kept the details hidden. I didn't want to delve into the darkness of the past any further. The ghostly presence in her home continued to haunt us, and we couldn't bear it any longer. Eventually we moved out, leaving the house to its haunted past. Even now, years later, I'm still haunted by the memories of that house and the little girl that died there. What did I encounter on my college campus? The night was pitch black, and only the sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. The small Methodist college in North Georgia mountains was eerily quiet, except for the fraternity meeting that went on late into the night. The last person to leave was a young student who gathered his belongings and exited the building. As he stepped outside, he was hit by an intense feeling of dread. It was like there was something watching him, following him, and it was close, too close. Despite his fear, he turned around and saw nothing, but the feeling persisted, growing more and more intense. He picked up his pace, hoping to shake off the ominous presence, but it only seemed to draw closer. It felt like a cold hand was reaching out to grab him, to drag him down into the depths of hell. As he walked, he felt the presence behind him getting closer and closer. He could feel hot breath on his neck and the feeling of eyes staring at him. He tried to shake it off, but the presence persisted. It was as if something was trying to possess him and take over his body and soul. He saw some chapel on the way, and as he crossed its path, the presence suddenly vanished. He could breathe again, and he felt like he had just escaped a horrible fate. But the memory stayed with him, haunting him for the years to come. Was it a ghost, a demon, or something more malevolent? He never knew for sure, but he did know that he never wanted to experience anything like that ever again. Just saw a shadow person. It was a typical night just like any other, and the darkness of the room surrounded me in a warm blanket. I was lying on my bed scrolling through my phone when I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. I sat up, feeling like someone was watching me, and that's when I saw it. A small shadow person jumping down from my office table. At first I was confused and I thought maybe it was just a trick of the light, but as the shadow darted across the room and headed towards the door, my heart started racing. I tried to call out, but the voice was stuck in my throat. The shadow person disappeared into the darkness and I was left feeling disoriented and scared. I tried to calm myself down, thinking that it was maybe my imagination playing tricks on me. But the unease stayed with me, and the more I thought about it, the more it had just happened, the more terrified I completely became. As I lay there in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak and rustle of the house made me jump, and my mind kept conjuring up terrifying images of what the shadow person might do next. I tried to tell myself that it was just a one-time thing, and there was nothing to be afraid of, but deep down, I knew that something was wrong. The feeling of being watched never went away, and it seemed like the shadow person was always lurking, just out of sight. Days turned into weeks and my fear only grew stronger. I tried to ignore it and push it to the back of my mind, but it was always there, like a shadow hanging over me. Every night I would lie in bed listening to the sounds of my house, waiting for the shadow person to make another appearance. And then one night it happened. I woke up to a cold breeze blowing through the room, and I knew that the shadow person was there. I could feel its presence all around me like a thick fog, and I couldn't escape. I tried to get up and run away, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen with fear, and the shadow person seemed to be getting closer and closer. I could feel its breath on my neck, and I knew that this was it. I was going to die. But then, just as sudden as it had appeared, the shadow person was gone. I was alone in the darkness, my heart racing, my body shaking. I knew that I'd encountered something truly terrifying, something that I would never forget. It was supposed to be a normal day, just like any other. But sometimes the most ordinary days can turn to the most terrifying experiences of your life. This is exactly what happened to me. I was visiting my girlfriend at her family's house, a century-old building with a rich history of death and tragedy. Despite experiencing a few strange occurrences in the past, nothing could have prepared me for what was about to happen. We were sitting in the living room talking to her grandmother about family history and ancestry when we heard an unexplained sound. First, we didn't think much of it, but it persisted, getting louder and more unsettling with each passing moment. My girlfriend asked me to investigate, so I headed into the kitchen, thinking it was just a mundane household sound. However, when I got there, it was anything but mundane. There on the counter was a fortune cookie from a Chinese takeout we had earlier, and then out of nowhere it moved. It wasn't just a slight shift or a simple vibration, it moved a whole inch, and the worst part? There was no explanation for it. There was no draft or wind, no logical explanation whatsoever. It was as if something unseen was playing a cruel game with us. My heart raced as I stumbled back into the living room trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. Was it a ghost, a demon, some other malevolent force? I had no answers, only a growing sense of fear and dread. In that moment, I realized that I had been foolish to doubt the existence of the supernatural. My skepticism was shattered, and I was left with an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. I began to recite the Hail Mary prayer, seeking some sort of comfort and protection, but the fear remained. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the house grew more and more ominous. Every creak and groan of the building seemed to be amplified, every shadow taking on a sinister quality. It was as if the house itself was alive, and it was not happy with our presence. To this day, I still don't know what caused that fortune cookie to move, but I do know that I'll never forget the terror I felt in that moment, or the sense of unease that lingered long after. Some things are better left unexplained, and some houses are better left unexplored. I have to shower, but I'm dreading it. The dread that fills his chest was suffocating as he stood in front of the bathroom, his hand shaking as he reached for the knob. The memory of what happened a few days ago still fresh in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from behind the door. He took a deep breath and slowly turned the knob, cautiously pushing the door open. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of mold and mildew. His eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of movement, any indication that he wasn't alone. The shower curtain was drawn, and he couldn't hear the faint sound of water running. He took a step forward, and the floor creaked under his weight. The sound echoed through the empty house, and he froze, waiting for a response. Silence. He cautiously walked toward the shower, his heart racing in his chest. He pulled the curtain back, and what he saw made his blood run cold. There, standing in the shower, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its skin was pale and translucent. Its eyes were empty sockets, and it had a gaping hole where its nose should be. It turned its head towards him, and a low, guttural growl escaped from its lips. He stumbled backwards, slipping on the wet tiles, and fell hard on his back. The creature stepped out of the shower with its long arms reaching out toward him. He scrambled onto his feet and bolted out of the room, his heart pounding in his ears. As he ran down the hallway, he could hear the creature's footsteps behind him, its ragged breathing hot in his neck. He burst through the front door, his lungs burning from the exertion, and collapsed on the front lawn. He lay there gasping for air as the creature stood at the threshold of the house, its eyes fixated on him. It raised its arms, and swarms of insects started pouring out of the holes of his body and crawled towards him. He closed his eyes and prayed for it to end, for the nightmare to be over, but when he opened them again, he was back in the bathroom. The creature was in front of him. He screamed, and the creature lunges toward him, its fingers wrapped around his throat, and then everything went black. My mom brought home furniture, and I can hear them knocking. Sunday morning rolls around, and my family and I get ready to head to the markets as per our weekly ritual. When we arrive, we park and head to the race course where the markets were held. We were walking around for 30 minutes or so before my mom found an antique stall. She fell in love with the wooden TV unit. It was beautifully stained oak wood with stained glass on the side cupboard doors and solid oak on the front cupboards. As soon as she saw it, she bought it instantly and got her now ex-husband to take it to the car. It was too heavy for any of my siblings for night help, so we all ended up going in the car. Once the unit was loaded in and my mom was satisfied, it was well hidden and safe. We headed back to the stall as my mom had seen a bookcase and a chest that looked to be a set with the unit. We arrived back at the same spot, but the stall had disappeared. My mom asked the neighboring stalls if they knew where the antique stall had gone, and everyone said the same thing. There are no antique stalls here. Defeated and confused, my mom decided that it was it for the markets and we headed home. First night the unit was brought into the house, I heard loud knocking coming from the living room. It grew louder and only continued for about 30 seconds, but it was enough to make me sleep under my blanket for the rest of the night. Next morning, after walking to the kitchen to get ready for school, feeling like death, I saw my older brother and mom had similar tiredness as me. I was too tired to ask, but thankfully my brother did anyways. Come to find out, they both heard the exact same knocking from the night before. It happened daily. 2 weeks later, it got worse. At around 2 or 3 a.m., a couple of weeks later, I saw a figure standing in my doorway, looking away from me. I took my chance and slipped under my blanket again. This continued happening. The figure kept creeping closer and closer every night I awoke. 2 days later, my mom encountered a man in a wheelchair sitting at the end of her bed, staring at her and her ex, watching them sleep. On the same night, my older brother saw a woman float past his room at the back of the house, facing the backyard, with only her upper half. The window is only at the top 1/3 half of the wall, so about 3 or 4 meters above the ground. My mom's ex didn't believe her until he woke up one day in the middle of the night, and this has now been about 3 days after my brother's sighting. This was the final straw for us. We found a new rental within 2 days and left everything behind to whoever moved in after us. We hope you made it. We hope you were able to stay hidden. We hope you were able to stay quiet. A ghost in our house. It all started around 18 years ago, maybe even longer, as I woke up as my grandpa and grandpa were at a get-together with friends. I sleep in the highest part of a 3rd floor, together with my grandma. While my grandpa slept, I woke up in the middle of the night. I heard whispers coming from the commode in my sleeping room, which takes up pretty much most of the wall. It sounded like somebody was calling for a cat to pet it or offer it food, and then they went down, crying since it was scared. But below, like I said, there was no one. It was still like someone had been there. And as I opened the door, I heard snoring coming from my grandpa's room, which sounded pretty much like his. And I would from memory say that it was him, but he was away with my grandma. The next thing which happened was around 2 to 3 years after my grandpa died, which was 6 or 7 years ago. As I came from my weekly drinking and chilling downstairs at around midnight, as I entered the dining room, I saw clear as day my grandpa lying on the couch in his favorite sleeping position, sleeping happily. But of course he was gone pretty fast as I looked. For the next few weeks I hoped to see him there again, which didn't happen again to this day. Now in the last 3 years I have regularly long scratches on my back and my arms. It happens at least once a month. And there's a scratch which bled on my back, but it scraped off sometime before I woke up. Now the most recent paranormal activity was around 2 years ago on a Monday. My grandma was at a meeting with her friends, and me and her shut everything off before she left. And I went to where I usually am in the house, upstairs. And after going upstairs for 2 hours, every light and TV was turned on, and at first, I thought my grandma had returned home early from the meetup without telling me, which would have been a bit strange, but nothing too special, till I was standing behind the living room door, as everything all at once turned off from 1 second to the next. I was engulfed in total darkness, and believe it or not, I was scared as hell. I made my way upstairs again and went to my computer, but after 30 or so minutes, I heard something and maybe Freon. The staircase had some noises. I heard someone, or I think that someone said something to come up to where I am. I heard the steps getting closer and closer, and as I was sure it was now in my stock, I called out, "Grandma," but no one answered, so I yelled out, "Heidi." Every name from my family that I knew, but no answer. I heard the steps now at the door, but no answer. So I waited for whoever was standing at the door, but no one opened it, so I stood up to check. No one, so I go down. That are the ones that I can say, yeah, this has no explanation whatsoever till today. Some other stuff that happened, I tell myself it might just be that I'm hallucinating from alcohol, or maybe I'm just a doll which moved its head. Button trails. It was a house that was filled with secrets, and the longer I lived there, the more I discovered. It all started with the little buttons. I'd find them scattered along the hallway leading to my grandma's room. At first it was just a few, but over time, the trails grew longer and the buttons became more numerous. I couldn't explain it. I didn't have siblings, and no one in my family seemed to know where the buttons were coming from. The only clue I had was a bag of sewing supplies in my closet, but it didn't make sense. I had never touched the bag, and it didn't seem like anyone else had either. As time rolled on, more strange things began to happen. I would hear whispers in the hallway at night, and sometimes I would feel a cold breeze on my face, even though the windows were closed. My grandma would talk about feeling a presence in her room, and sometimes she would wake up to find buttons scattered across her bed. I began to research the history of the house and found out that it had once belonged to a seamstress who had died in the house. Her spirit was said to haunt the hallways, searching for her lost buttons. But it wasn't just the seamstress's spirit that was haunting the house. As I delved deeper into the history, I found out that my grandmother's dad had died in the house many years ago, and as I pieced everything together, I realized that the buttons were a message from beyond the grave. My grandma's dad had always been a practical joker, and it seems that even in death he was still playing his tricks. There was a darker message in the buttons, too. There was a reminder that his passing was a way to let us know that he was still watching over us. I don't live in that house anymore, but I still think about it often. The buttons have been a small thing, but they opened a door to a world of paranormal activity that I never knew existed. And I know now that even in death, our loved ones are still with us, watching over us and guiding us on our journey. Two-year-old daughter seems to have paranormal skills. It was though something had taken hold of their small daughter, something beyond their understanding, and had set its sight on tormenting them with their own home. The family had been experiencing strange occurrences for weeks, but it was the incident with the pacifier that left them paralyzed with fear. Despite being an atheist and a skeptic, the father couldn't deny the inexplicable events that were unfolding before his eyes. Their daughter, only 2 years old, seemed to be breaking through an invisibility spell, revealing to them a world they never knew existed. The pacifier had vanished without a trace, and the family had searched every inch of the apartment multiple times. Yet when their daughter pointed under her crib, there it was, as though it had been placed there by an unseen hand. It was just one of the many bizarre occurrences that had been plagued by the family. Their daughter had also pointed to an empty wall, claiming that a dead man was there. It was a word she had never heard before, yet she knew exactly what it meant. They had even heard voices coming from the empty room, and lights would flicker and fall as they talked about the paranormal even as a joke. The family was living in a house of horrors, and there was no escape. Other things disappeared or moved from one place to another during the night, leaving them feeling vulnerable and exposed. Every shadow was a potential threat. Every creak in the floorboards, a sign of something lurking just out of sight. The father had tried to rationalize the event, to come up with a logical explanation for what was happening, but it was becoming increasingly clear that it was something beyond their comprehension at work. They were trapped in a nightmare, with no end in sight. New Orleans Terror. When I was a kid, I went on church service trip to New Orleans. Our aim was to help clean up remaining damages from when Katrina hit. About midway into the trip, we helped remove brush and debris from some plot of land so a playground could be built. We were all ecstatic because the day was incredibly productive, and we really believed that the spiritual forces of good and godliness were at work through us. That night we visited Bourbon Street to have dinner, listen to some live music, and celebrate the work that had been done. At some point, one of the church leaders was taking pictures and pointed her camera to the sky facing a distant casino. The sky was clear and no clouds. She snapped a photo, and when the screen displayed her photo, there was a silver-looking face smiling heinously while clasping his hands protecting the casino. His face seemed metallic with many wrinkles. If you could imagine the Heath-Ledger Joker, but without eyes, a huge mouth, no teeth, and many wrinkles, like fabric being pulled in multiple directions. That's what it looked like. It had wet-looking orange hair that draped about midway down its face. Its nose was missing. The entire group went hysterical when they all looked at the photo, and the rest of the night we were disturbed. The joy we had felt all day instantly went away. Few of us slept. I had a variety of hallucinations in the dark of demons falling into me. I didn't get any sleep. There were a few girls in the room next to me who I could hear crying in terror about what had taken place. I say this to illustrate how the incident felt like a direct, successful attempt to hijack our spirits of positive energy. One person in the group tried to come up with multiple natural explanations for the incident, but the leader who took the photo always had new details to explain how it wasn't a natural explanation for what had taken place. This incident alone has been enough to keep my agnostic ass alert and aware of all possibilities. Saw a shadow figure under a bridge. It was a dark and eerie night, the kind that sends shivers down your spine. The group of friends were gathered under the bridge, surrounded by graffiti that adorned the walls. They were having a good time taking pictures and chatting about nothing in particular. That's when it happened. Out of the corner of her eye, one of the girls saw a shadowy figure sitting on the far right of the ledge. She rubbed her eyes, thinking it was just a trick of the light, but the figure remained. It was a man sitting there quietly, as if observing them. The girl tried to ignore it, thinking she was just imagining things, but the figure remained, almost taunting her. As the conversation turned to the paranormal, the girl finally spoke up and mentioned what she had seen. To her surprise, her friend confirmed that she had seen the figure too. They both felt a sense of dread as they realized that they were not alone. The figure remained watching them silently. The girl decided to leave, unable to shake off the feeling of unease. She walked away alone, praying and hoping that she would make it home safely. As she walked, she couldn't help but feel like the figure was following her. She quickened her pace, but the feeling only grew stronger. Finally, she made it home safe and sound. But the memory of that night would haunt her forever. She never went back to that bridge at night, afraid of what else she might see.